Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly, well not that quietly, into the flickering shadows of a time when desire was dangerous, sex was suspicious, and sin was, somehow, absolutely everywhere. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where everyone claimed to be chaste, but the Haylofts told a different story. You're about to witness a world obsessed with keeping lust behind locked doors, while those same doors kept swinging open, usually after dark, often during Lent, and occasionally right under the noses of the local clergy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean, I'm about to spend 30 episodes telling bedtime stories about medieval fornication. At least reward the effort, yeah? Also, I'm curious. What city are you listening from and what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. It's always cool knowing who's listening and when. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a muddy street in a small medieval village, somewhere in England, France, or maybe the Holy Roman Empire. Doesn't really matter. The walls are wood and wattle, the roofs are thatched, and every breath you take carries the scent of smoke, sweat, and someone's goat. It's dark, not pitch black, but that soft, oily darkness that comes from candlelight leaking through shuttered windows. You hear the creak of old wood, a whisper here, a giggle there. Behind those thin walls, a married baker and the miller's wife, two unmarried peasants keeping each other warm. A monk in a panic, muttering Hail Marys and promising it'll never happen again. You feel it almost immediately. Sex is everywhere, and so is the fear of it. Medieval society at its core was built around contradiction. The church taught that human sexuality was dangerous, born of original sin, and barely tolerable even inside marriage. But guess what? People were still people. The same instincts that caused Adam and Eve to reach for that fruit. Yeah, those were still going strong in 1124 or 1378 or whenever you're imagining this. And no matter how many sermons were shouted or sins were confessed, the human body had its own ideas. You walk past the village church, modest, damp, stone cold in every sense. Inside, a priest is preparing his homily. It's going to be about lust. Again. This one includes that old favourite, the story of Saint Agnes, who chose death over desire, and St. Cecilia, who supposedly convinced her husband to become celibate on their wedding night. Not exactly inspiring bedtime material, but behind the pulpit, this same priest may have a mistress living nearby, maybe even kids. Some bishops had entire households of illegitimate children, and everyone kind of knew. But as long as they paid their penance and didn't flaunt it, society just looked the other way. Here's your first historical fact of the night. In many towns, clerical concubinage, that's the fancy term for priests having unofficial wives, was so common that people stopped pretending to care. Councils kept trying to ban it. Clergy just kept doing it anyway. But here's your quirky twist. Even as sex was condemned, it was also used as entertainment. At medieval festivals, peasants performed bawdy plays full of innuendo. Townfools told jokes about monks chasing milkmaids. And on feast days like Carnival, all bets were off. Masks, drinking, cross-dressing and risque behaviour were not only tolerated but expected. One scholar called it the pressure valve of Christendom, because you can't repress desire forever without something bursting. And then, of course, there's the debate. Scholars still argue how much of this was real and how much was just fantasy projected by later writers. Was medieval society really that obsessed with controlling lust? Or is that our modern lens, fixating on the juiciest parts of the past? You're still walking. Now it's late, truly dark. You pass a lone torch sputtering in the wind. Somewhere, a door slams. Someone laughs. Someone cries. You get the sense that morality here is less about right and wrong and more about hiding your sins better than your neighbour. A lot of this lust, by the way, wasn't glamorous. It wasn't romantic. It was deeply tangled in power. Men over women, nobles over servants, priests over parishioners. The church preached virtue, but the system was built to protect the powerful, not the vulnerable. And when scandal broke, it was usually the woman who got blamed. Sound familiar? Still, medieval people weren't prudish in the way modern pop culture sometimes paints them. They joked about sex. They had sex. They gave birth in public rooms, gossiped about who was doing what with whom, and passed down surprisingly detailed advice, sometimes in the form of medical manuals, sometimes in whispery old wives' tales. One manuscript from the 13th century includes a recipe for an aphrodisiac involving sparrow brains, wine, and pepper. Is it real? Who knows? But someone took the time to write it down with fancy calligraphy, so apparently it mattered. And the Church, in all its contradiction, also created entire confessional manuals, big books full of incredibly specific sexual sins and their proper penances, like disturbingly specific. We're talking stuff that you wouldn't even think to ask about, which begs the question, who was doing all this? You turn down a narrow alley where the smell of roasting meat and animal dung blends into something oddly comforting. In a tiny window, a candle flickers. A woman kneels beside her bed, praying. Her husband snores behind her, mouth open, oblivious. She's not praying because she sinned, she's praying because she wants to, and somewhere out there a nobleman is paying a poet to write a love ballad about his lady, who he's never even spoken to. It's a strange world, a deeply human world, and tonight you've just cracked open the first door into it. You don't get very far before someone starts talking about Eve again. You know, that Eve, the one with the apple, the snake, and the whole plunging humanity into sin forever thing. In the medieval mind, Eve isn't just the mother of mankind, she's the first temptress, the ultimate cautionary tale, and if you were hoping for a balanced take on gender tonight, sorry. The Middle Ages had opinions and they weren't shy about them, especially when it came to who got blamed for lust. You're seated now, maybe in a chilly little chapel, maybe under a tree where a village sermon's being delivered al fresco because the church smells like mildew. The priest is talking about temptation, and it sounds suspiciously like he's blaming women for pretty much everything. Lust? Women cause it. Sin? Women tempt men into it. The fall of man? Yup, women again. The logic is thin, the misogyny is thick, and it all loops back to that juicy Genesis story. But what's really wild is how this whole blame me for sex thing gets spun. Medieval theologians take that bite of fruit and turn it into a full-blown cosmic event. That single act? It didn't just get Adam and Eve booted from paradise, it introduced concupiscence into the world. That's the fancy term they use for lust, and it's treated like a disease embedded in every single body from that moment forward. You're born with it, you die with it, and you're never ever allowed to enjoy it too much. Here's your historical fact. St. Augustine, one of the OG influencers of Christian doctrine, argued that even married sex was sinful if it was done for pleasure. That's right. Having a good time in bed, even with your legal, church-approved spouse, was at best tolerated, and at worst spiritually dangerous. He thought that the only time sex wasn't a problem was when it was purely procreative. No moaning, no pleasure, no eye contact. Just a deeply unfun transaction to produce tiny Christians, and people took him seriously, for centuries, which led to this deeply weird paradox. Sex was necessary for survival, because people kept dying of plague, war, and childbirth. But it was also the most morally suspect thing you could do, besides heresy or, like, tax fraud against the bishop. You might think, okay, so people just didn't talk about sex, right? Not even close. Theologians were obsessed. They wrote long treatises debating the nature of desire, when it became sinful, whether it could be accidental, and brace yourself, whether erections could happen in paradise. Yes, there's an actual 13th century debate about whether Adam had a boner in Eden, and whether that was proof he was innocent or proof he was doomed. This was considered serious theological scholarship. Your quirky fact for the night? One monk argued that before the fall, humans could control their genitals the way you control your arm. Just move it when needed and stop it when not. Post-fall, that ship had sailed. Now the body did its own thing, betraying you with sudden spontaneous lust at the worst possible times. A sneeze? Fine. A visible reminder of your sinful flesh? That's grounds for penance. Still, not everyone agreed. This is where the scholarly debate creeps in. Not all medieval thinkers hated sex equally. Some, like Thomas Aquinas, tried to balance the spiritual and physical, arguing that sex within marriage wasn't inherently sinful, just less virtuous than celibacy. Others tried to frame desire as a test, a way to grow spiritually stronger by resisting temptation. And a few brave outliers even hinted that pleasure might be kind of okay. But those ideas stayed mostly on the margins because the dominant message was clear. Pleasure was dangerous, and women were the cause. You find yourself at a marketplace now, watching a group of old women trading gossip and dried herbs. One of them swears her neighbour's daughter got pregnant just from sitting too close to a boy during Mass. Another insists that the Virgin Mary never actually experienced labour pains, because she was too holy for that kind of thing. There's a third, chuckling softly, who claims she once saw the local abbot in the woods with a milkmaid. Everyone pretends not to believe her, but they all lean in closer. You catch the pattern. Everything in this world is tinged with fear and fascination. Lust is an invisible force, prowling in the shadows, sneaking into dreams, blamed for everything from bad weather to crop failure. If a cow stops giving milk, someone must have sinned. If a child is born with a deformity, clearly the parents did something improper. If you have a nightmare about a seductive figure sitting on your chest, that's not sleep paralysis. It's a literal sex demon. And don't think the church wasn't in on this fear-mongering. They taught that every time you gave into lust, you were inviting demonic influence, especially if it was, solo, masturbation, absolute spiritual disaster. Some confessional manuals described it in terms of wasted life force, and others suggested it could actually summon evil spirits. Imagine being 15 in 1293, waking up in a cold stone room after a dream, convinced you just damned your soul and attracted a demon. That's your adolescence. Yet despite all this fear, people kept doing it. Because of course they did. Sex wasn't just unavoidable, it was human. And even if everyone was taught to hate it, they also couldn't look away from it. It shows up in art, in poetry, in the margins of Bibles, where little naked figures dance between Latin prayers. Lust was always there, giggling from the corners of a stained glass window, or peeking out from beneath a monk's robe in a bawdy tale told at the tavern. As the evening deepens, you find yourself sitting by a fire, warmed more by the stories than the flames. A travelling bard is telling a tale of a knight tempted by a witch, of a queen whose virtue is so powerful, her mere gaze makes men fall to their knees. You notice that underneath the fantasy, there's a moral, but also a message. Sex is power, and power, especially when it resides in a woman's body, scares people. It's getting late. The fire crackles low. Somewhere an owl hoots, and even now, after all those sermons and debates, you realise something essential. The fear of lust was never just about morality. It was about control, controlling women, controlling bodies, controlling pleasure. And like most things worth controlling, it never stayed locked up for long. By now you're getting the sense that medieval sex wasn't just about who was doing what under the sheepskins. It was about rules. So many rules. And those rules came straight from the top, or rather, from behind the thick stone walls of churches, monasteries and bishoprics, where men in robes spent centuries drawing up elaborate instructions for what people could and couldn't do in bed. You're about to step into one of the strangest, most meticulous rabbit holes of the Middle Ages, the church's sexual rule book. Imagine walking into a small village chapel, draughty, quiet and smelling faintly of wet limestone and burned wax. You kneel beside a heavy wooden screen. On the other side, the priest is clearing his throat. It's time for confession, and tonight's sins? Oh, they're spicy, except you're not the one talking. You're just eavesdropping as the priest flips through a thick volume known as a penitential, a kind of moral manual filled with sins and the exact penance required for each one. Here's your historical fact. Some of these penitentials read like medieval sex encyclopedias. 7th century Irish monks, for instance, compiled lists so specific and bizarre, they feel more like voyeuristic fantasy than moral guidance. Kissing with intent? That's 3 days of fasting, sex standing up, double that. Oral anything? You don't even want to know. And God help you if you had the misfortune of doing something unnatural with your spouse. Because suddenly the penance turns into months of fasting, years of alms giving, and an immediate upgrade to the deluxe guilt package. The logic behind this was, at best, tortured. Sex was technically permitted inside marriage, but only for procreation, and only in a limited number of positions. Missionary was considered the only proper choice, and even then, it was best not to enjoy it too much. If there was any laughter, any lingering touches, or, God forbid, any female pleasure involved, things started tipping toward the sinful. Medieval theologians weren't just worried about what people were doing, they were deeply invested in how and why they were doing it. So you're sitting there, flipping through these old Latin scribbles, and you start to wonder, who came up with this stuff? Were they okay? And did they realise that in trying to outlaw desire, they were spending a lot of time imagining it? Which brings us to your quirky fact of the night. Some of these rules were so elaborate they included sin guides for animals. Yes, bestiality had its own subsection, but there were also stern warnings about sex on feast days during Lent, on Sundays in churches, fair, and even while the woman was menstruating. That last one? A major no-no. According to one particularly uptight bishop, if a man knowingly had sex with a menstruating woman, he was to be excommunicated for 7 years. That's right, 7. Because apparently nothing says moral danger like a uterus doing its monthly thing. You might think this all stayed behind the confession screen, but no. The church didn't just define sexual sin, it punished it publicly. A man caught in adultery might have to strip to his waist, walk barefoot through the village, and be flogged, while a bell rang to warn others about the dangers of giving in to fleshly temptations. A woman might be paraded with her hair unbound, symbolising her moral chaos, while neighbours whispered and spat. Shame wasn't just a tool, it was the main event. Still, this wasn't just about the rules, this was about control. In a society where survival depended on order, sexuality was one of the most volatile forces around. It could disrupt marriages, blur social boundaries, create illegitimate heirs, and call into question the authority of the church itself. So they had to codify it, wrap it in Latin, bury it in bureaucracy. That way, at least someone was in charge of the chaos. But not everyone bought into the rulebook. There were loopholes, people lied in confession, people bribed priests. Sometimes they just ignored the rules entirely. After all, in many parts of medieval Europe, a village priest was a local guy, not a terrifying inquisitor, but someone who maybe helped you plough your fields last spring. He had his own secrets, maybe even his own woman on the side. You could see how confession might turn into a bit of a social negotiation rather than a spiritual reckoning. Which brings us to the debate. Scholars still argue, how strictly were these rules actually enforced? Did the average peasant know the 7 levels of marital sin, or did they just wing it and hope for the best? Some historians think that church doctrine was like an elite fantasy, one that only existed in books and synods, not in barns or bedrooms. Others argue the opposite, that fear of hellfire was so ingrained it shaped even the smallest daily decisions. The truth? Probably somewhere in the middle, squirming under a sheepskin. You're outside again now, strolling past a cluster of cottages as the sun sinks behind the trees. Through thin wooden walls you hear muffled voices, arguments, laughter, a low moan quickly silenced. Behind every door is a story, a sin, a secret, a prayer for forgiveness that might or might not come. And it's not just the lower classes navigating this maze of desire and shame. Nobles too were subject to these same rules, at least in theory. But in practice, well, we'll get to that later. For now, you're watching a young couple sneak toward the woods under the cover of dusk. They're unmarried, they're laughing, they're definitely not thinking about confession, and maybe that's the most human part of all this. No matter how thick the rulebook got, or how stern the sermon, people still risked it. Because even in a world built on guilt and fear, the pull of desire was stronger. Sometimes, all it took was a look, a hand brushing a sleeve, a chance moment in the wrong season on the wrong day. And just like that, sin found its way in. Which, if you're the church, is the point. The rules weren't just there to guide people, they were there to remind everyone that they were already guilty, that they needed the church to absolve them, that salvation was a service and sex was the bill. You pass a monk on the road now, face downcast, sandals dusty. He clutches a parchment, probably another list of banned behaviours. You wonder what he's thinking. You wonder what he's done. But neither of you says a word. It doesn't take long before you notice a peculiar pattern. The people preaching the loudest about lust are often the ones tangled deepest in it. You're about to follow the trail into the cloisters, abbeys, and holy halls of medieval Europe, where celibacy wasn't just a lifestyle, it was the rule, at least on paper. In practice, well, let's just say that for some clergy, forsaking the flesh meant keep it quiet and try not to get caught. Tonight, you walk the stone corridors of a Benedictine monastery. It's quiet, peaceful. The air smells of incense, old books, and cold stone. You pass monks in robes, heads bowed, lips moving in prayer. Everything about this place says restraint, discipline, holiness. But underneath that stillness, something else hums, a tension that doesn't match the chants echoing off the chapel walls. Here's your historical fact. By the 11th century, official church policy required priests to remain celibate. No wives, no sex, no concubines, not even a flirty look during Vespers. This wasn't just a spiritual matter, it was practical. Priests with heirs could pass down church land like family property, and that was a big problem if the church wanted to keep control over its assets. So the rule was clear. If you wore the collar, you zipped the robe. Permanently. But of course, human nature doesn't fold neatly under doctrine. Throughout medieval Europe, there were priests with long-term mistresses, monks who paid for sex, and even bishops who lived openly with their lovers. In some towns, people just shrugged. "That's Father Martin," they'd say, nodding toward a child who looked suspiciously like him. Bit of a wild Lent that year. You find yourself in the cloister garden now. There's a monk sitting on a bench, fingers working through his rosary beads. He looks up when he hears your footsteps. His eyes are tired, and behind them, you glimpse something. Not guilt exactly, but weariness. A weight that's more personal than spiritual. You wonder what it's like, taking vows at 17, and then spending your entire adult life pretending not to notice someone's smile, or someone's touch, or during a particularly long winter, the way Sister Beatrice sings during evening prayer. Because here's the thing, monasteries and convents weren't passionless voids. They were filled with people, young ones, old ones, some who joined for faith, others for politics, others because their families dumped them there to avoid paying dowries, and not all of them had the discipline or desire to snuff out their sexuality. Let's talk about the clergy's unofficial bedrooms. In the 14th century, Pope Boniface IX gave a wink and nod solution for priests who refused to give up their concubines. Instead of kicking them out of the church, he charged them a concubine tax. That's right. There was an actual fee for keeping a lover on the side. It became a profitable side hustle for the Vatican, sin sanctioned and monetized. That's your quirky fact tonight. Priests were literally taxed for sleeping with women, and the money went straight into the church's coffers. It didn't stop them, of course. It just made it part of the system. But not everyone was laughing. Reformers like Peter Damian were horrified. He wrote letters dripping with righteous anger, condemning priests for impure habits, accusing entire monasteries of becoming dens of sin. Some monasteries, he claimed, weren't just dealing with heterosexual lust. They were full of sodomitical heresy. His words, not mine. And while some of that may have been true, a lot of it sounds like overblown moral panic stirred up by frustrated celibates with too much time and ink on their hands. Still, it raises the debate. Were medieval monasteries hotbeds of secret desire? Or are modern historians just too eager to project scandal onto silence? Some argue that the records of clerical sin reflect rare exceptions, outliers in a mostly pious system. Others believe the rot ran deep, hidden under layers of ritual and robes, and honestly, the truth probably lives somewhere in that grey space, where devotion and repression brush shoulders in the dark. You're walking now past the convent, a high-walled stone building with tiny slit windows and a heavy wooden gate. Nuns sing inside, voices rising like smoke in the dusk. But even here, far from the lusty chaos of towns and taverns, sin finds its way in. Tales of pregnant nuns circulated in the cities like scandalous poetry. Some true, some invented. But always whispered with that tone. Half horror, half thrill. And when nuns fell, the punishments were severe. A nun discovered to be pregnant might be walled into a cell for life. Literally bricked in, left with only a tiny hole for food and water. A walking warning to her sisters about the price of broken vows. Yet for all the fear and punishment, love still bloomed in secret letters passed between abbeys, in glances across prayer books, in the quiet intimacy of confession. You imagine a young monk, barely 20, pressed against a stone wall, heart hammering in the dark after brushing fingers with another novice. It's not always about lust. Sometimes it's just about wanting to be touched. You reach the edge of the monastery grounds. The sun has fully set now, leaving the sky a deep, inky blue. Torches flicker along the outer wall. Somewhere a bell tolls Compline. The monks will retreat to their cells, whisper prayers in the dark and fight off dreams with clenched fists and desperate psalms. But not all of them will win. Desire has a way of slipping under locked doors. It doesn't care about robes, rules, or relics. And for all their warnings and penances, even the holiest men and women were still human. sometimes painfully so. You pass by the church again on your way out, its silhouette rising like a stern parent against the stars. And as you glance back, you can't help but wonder how many confessions it has heard, how many vows were broken, how many whispered prayers weren't for forgiveness, but for just a little more time before the next sermon came. You leave the cloisters behind and head out into the open fields, where the air smells of earth and livestock and the promise of something less constrained. This is peasant territory now, where people live in rough timber homes, share their beds with animals for warmth, and navigate life without manuscripts or monasteries to spell out every rule. But don't get too cozy. If you thought things were simpler out here, think again. Lust lives in the haylofts too. It's just a little messier, a little sweatier, and a lot more practical. You crouch beside a thatched cottage as dusk settles. Inside, a man and woman sit by the fire sharing a hunk of bread and a jug of something fermented. They're not married, but they've been walking out together for a while now, and everyone in the village knows what that means. This isn't courtly love or romantic poetry. This is survival. If you're going to spend your life hauling wood, tending animals, and giving birth in a drafty one-room hut, you might as well do it with someone you like. Here's your historical fact. In many medieval communities, especially in Northern Europe, premarital sex was technically frowned upon but quietly accepted if the couple planned to marry. It even had a name, hand fasting. You'd publicly declare your intention to wed, sometimes clasp hands in front of witnesses, and from that point on, sleeping together was treated as a kind of informal engagement. If a pregnancy happened, the marriage would usually follow. If it didn't, sometimes the relationship just faded out. Either way, the church mostly grumbled from a distance. But here's your quirky little twist. In parts of Scandinavia and the British Isles, couples would often consummate their relationship while lying in bed with a plank of wood between them. It was supposed to discourage full intercourse, just a little middle school style heavy petting with a medieval obstacle course. These boards had names, bundling boards, or in some cases literal chastity planks. Spoiler alert, they didn't always work. You wander into a barn now. It's warm, quiet, and smells like straw, damp wood, and something musky you'd rather not identify. A young couple is up in the loft, whispering, laughing, tangled in each other. They think they're alone, but the creaks and rustles of the barn tell you this scene is anything but rare. This is where a lot of medieval relationships began, in secret between chores, beneath the stars. And sure, the church disapproved, but honestly, rural priests often looked the other way. They had bigger concerns like crop failures and unpaid tithes. Still, sin was sin, and if things went too far and a baby came before the wedding, shame could fall like a hammer. Some communities made the couple perform public penance, others fined them. In the harshest cases, an unwed mother might be cast out, especially if the father denied responsibility. But most villages had a strange mix of moral judgment and grudging tolerance. After all, someone had to keep the population going, especially with disease and famine constantly thinning the ranks. This brings us to the ongoing scholarly debate. Were medieval peasants really as sexually free as some folk histories claim, or is that just a romanticised modern fantasy? The records are patchy. On one hand, court cases from manorial rolls show people being fined for fornication, adultery, and night walking, which is basically the 14th century version of creeping into someone's bed. On the other hand, there's evidence of widespread sexual autonomy, especially for women who owned land or inherited property. In some cases, women ran households alone, raised children without husbands, and even refused marriage altogether. So, were they rule breakers, survivors, or just people making the best of a chaotic world? You step into a small cottage now, ducking under the low beam. There's a baby in a basket, a toddler playing with a stick, and a woman humming softly as she stirs something in a pot. Her partner is outside splitting wood. They're not married by church standards, no witnesses, no priest, but everyone in the village sees them as a unit, and that's what matters. The church may have the power to define sin, but the village defines family. It wasn't always tender, though. Life out here was rough. Sex could be coercive, especially when social hierarchies got involved. A nobleman's son might take liberties with a serving girl, and she'd have no recourse. In some cases, a landowner had the right to approve or reject his peasant's marriage. Even more disturbingly, there were whispers about the jus primi noctis, the right of the first night, where a lord supposedly claimed the right to sleep with a peasant bride before her husband could. Most historians agree this was more myth than widespread reality, but even the rumour speaks volumes about how tangled sex, power and class were. You move through the village now, past a line of women washing clothes by the river. One of them is pregnant. Her friends tease her gently, ask who the father is. She smiles but doesn't answer. Maybe she doesn't know, or maybe she does and just doesn't want to share. Either way, no one calls her a sinner, at least not to her face. In some ways, this world is freer than the one behind stone walls and altar rails. There's less theory, less guilt, and a more practical sense of how things work. Sex isn't sacred here. It's ordinary, necessary, but that doesn't mean it's without meaning. People still fall in love. They still sneak glances, leave flowers, whisper promises in the dark. They just do it without Latin treatises or fear of papal bulls. Night is falling again. You watch a couple slip into their hut, hands brushing. No bundling board this time, just a shared blanket and the quiet creak of wood settling around them. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows, confused by the moonlight. An owl answers. And you? You sit under the stars, realizing that out here in the mud and the straw, lust isn't some monstrous temptation to be crushed. It's a part of life. Sometimes sweet, sometimes awkward, sometimes wildly inconvenient, but always present. You're back on the road now, leaving the smoky cottages and hay-strewn barns behind, and heading towards something a little more refined, though no less tangled in desire. The wind carries music from a nearby castle, delicate notes plucked from a lute, rising with laughter and the scent of honeyed wine. You're about to enter a world with silk and sapphires and way too many rules about love, the noble court. And here, lust plays a different game, disguised as honour, wrapped in poetry, and always performed just far enough from actual scandal. Welcome to the era of courtly love, where romance is theatre and the goal is to burn beautifully without ever catching fire. You slip through the great hall, where ladies in embroidered gowns float past knights in polished armour. Everything looks graceful, elegant, even the flirting. But don't let the manners fool you. Underneath all this chivalry is a simmering volcano of suppressed desire. A young troubadour sings a love ballad so dramatically tortured, you'd think someone stole his horse and crushed his soul. In reality, he's been pining for a married lady who smiled at him once during Lent. She's sitting 10 feet away, pretending not to hear. She definitely hears. Here's your historical fact. Courtly love emerged in the 12th century southern France and quickly spread across European noble courts. It was a kind of ritualized, often platonic romance, typically between a knight and a highborn lady who was married to someone else. And that part wasn't accidental. The whole idea was that true love had to be impossible. If it wasn't forbidden, it wasn't real. You had to suffer, write poems, pledge your loyalty, and pine tragically. If you actually got together? Well, now it was just adultery, and far less poetic. This wasn't just idle fantasy. These love games had rules, actual codes. Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century writer, compiled The Art of Courtly Love, a manual that outlined the stages of noble romance. Love, he claimed, made men more virtuous. It inspired bravery, generosity, and poetic skill. But only if it stayed unconsummated. The minute things got physical, the magic was gone, and so was the knight's moral shine. Lust ruined the love it had inspired. Tragic. Yes. Hypocritical. Absolutely. You're watching a young knight now, fresh from battle, kneeling before a lady twice his age. She extends a hand. He kisses it with just enough pressure to hint at what he's thinking. They've never touched beyond this. They never will. But he's written her 6 poems, carved her initials into his shield, and once, during a tournament, he let his opponent beat him just to impress her with his noble suffering. No one tells him how ridiculous that is. Everyone applauds. This is where things get delightfully weird. Courtly love was supposed to be non-physical, but it lived right next door to lust. The poems are dripping with innuendo, the music trembles with longing, and in the margins, well, a lot more was going on. Behind the masks and riddles, affairs did happen. Clandestine, risky, and often devastating. A noblewoman caught with a lover could lose her status, her marriage, even her life. A man might get off lighter unless the husband was powerful, or violent, or both. And here's your quirky fact. One noblewoman in the 12th century France was said to have challenged knights to jousts, promising her favour to the victor. Her favour turned out to be an embroidered ribbon tied around the man's arm and around her own thigh. Subtle? Not at all. But entirely in line with the logic of courtly love. Hint, suggest, gesture, but never say it outright. There's a scholarly debate that's still sizzling. Did courtly love ever reflect real relationships, or was it all literary fluff, an elite fantasy made up by bored aristocrats? Some historians argue it was mostly performance, a social script that allowed for controlled flirtation and ego-boosting heartbreak. Others point to letters and records suggesting that beneath the verses were genuine passions, often with real-world consequences. Love in the castle wasn't safer than love in the village, it was just better dressed. You step into the garden now, moonlight catching on stone fountains and rose petals. A pair of lovers sits on a bench, backs turned, talking too closely. They're using metaphors, of course. He's calling her a star, she's pretending to blush, but it's clear what's happening, and in the shadows, a third figure watching, a chaperone. Because here's the catch. No one in this world moves unobserved. Every glance is catalogued, every step judged. Even love is under surveillance. Not that it stops anyone. You pass by a window where a nobleman stares longingly into the dark. His wife is asleep. His thoughts are somewhere else. Maybe with a maid, maybe with a younger man he saw once at court. Courtly love made space for fluidity too. The same rules of longing applied across gender, though society had no polite words for what happened when they crossed boundaries. There were only rumours, and poems that spoke in riddles. Still, not all noble relationships were tormented epics. Some couples actually liked each other, some even married for love. But even then, they were expected to behave like they hadn't. Passion was undignified. Affection was private. Anything too loud, too physical, too real, well, that belonged in the peasant barns, not in noble bedchambers. Speaking of bedchambers, you find yourself peeking into one now. The canopied bed is massive, more decorative than functional. Marriage in this world is a contract, property exchanged, alliances sealed. The actual love? That's supposed to be saved for someone else, someone just out of reach, with clever eyes and tragic smiles. You close the door gently, stepping back into the corridor where a lute still plays, a night still broods, and a lady still sighs at the moon. It's a strange theatre, this noble dance. Everyone's playing roles, everyone knows the script. And somewhere in the silence between lines, real desire tries to breathe. The candlelight flickers along the stone walls, casting long shadows. You wonder if those shadows know more than the people do. What glances were exchanged? What letters were burned? What lips almost touched but never quite did? In the world of courtly love, wanting is the performance. Having? That's the sin. The stone halls of the noble courts fade behind you, and once again you're out among the winding paths of the countryside. But this time you're not wandering in search of poetry or longing glances. You're stepping into something much colder, more transactional. Less will they or won't they, and more what's she worth. Because tonight we're talking about wives, virgins, and other forms of medieval property. And yes, that title is exactly as depressing as it sounds. You enter a modest village home, the kind where 3 generations might share a bed, a fireplace, and a single chicken that seems to think it owns the place. A young girl, maybe 14, sits beside her mother. They're sewing, quiet, waiting. Her father is outside speaking to another man, older, wealthier, and clearly not here for a neighbourly chat. No one says the word dowry, but that's what it is. And no one says the word sale, but that's what it feels like. Here's your historical fact. In much of medieval Europe, marriage wasn't about love. It was a legal and economic agreement. A woman's body, specifically her fertility, was considered her primary asset. Her virginity, non-negotiable. It was the guarantee that any children born would be her husband's legitimate heirs. This wasn't just social pressure. It was literal law in many places. If a bride was discovered not to be a virgin on her wedding night, the marriage could be annulled, the dowry returned, and her reputation ruined beyond repair. You sit beside the hearth now, feeling the heat of it as the girl stares into the flames. Her mother murmurs something about how lucky she is. He's got land, she says, only lost one wife to fever. The girl doesn't reply. Maybe she's dreaming of running away. Or maybe she's just trying not to cry, because crying won't change anything. Meanwhile, across town in the manor house, a very different girl, wealthy, well-fed, surrounded by servants, is undergoing a similar ritual. though hers involves legal documents and property transfers, not just goats and bread. Noble daughters were often married off at even younger ages, their virginity obsessively guarded by governesses, nuns, and a frankly unhinged number of male relatives. Her bed linens might even be checked for blood after the wedding night, proof that she'd been intact. And if there was none, cue scandal, shame, maybe even annulment. Here's your quirky fact. Some medieval households kept what was called a virginity tester. No, not a device, just a nosy, usually older female relative whose job it was to physically inspect the bride before the wedding. These tests were based on wildly inaccurate ideas about anatomy, and honestly, they were more about theatre than truth. But in a world where a woman's value could hinge on the thinnest piece of tissue, theatre was everything. You wander through a quiet chapel now, where a marriage is taking place. The bride looks calm but not joyful. The groom looks twice her age. The priest mutters Latin. No one really smiles. This isn't a celebration, it's a transaction, and the ceremony doesn't even require her consent in many cases. As long as the fathers agree, that's enough. Love can come later, or not. Now here's where things get murky. There's a scholarly debate about how much agency medieval women really had in these situations. Some historians argue that noble women especially had considerable influence. They could manage estates, direct servants, even pressure their husbands politically. Others say that's wishful thinking, that for most women, especially peasants, marriage was a trap, a loss of control, freedom, even basic bodily autonomy. The truth, as usual, depends on the time, the place, and how much power the woman's family could wield. Back in the village, you pass a woman baking bread. She's got 6 children, 2 goats, and an expression like she hasn't slept since the Crusades. Her husband died last winter, and now she's available again, which mostly means she's worried someone will try to claim her before she can say no. Widows were vulnerable, not just to poverty, but to legal shenanigans. Without a male protector, their land, money, or even their children could be taken. Some chose to remarry fast. Others tried to hide their assets or pretend they were already spoken for. The game was brutal, and the rules rarely favoured them. And let's talk about the church again, because of course it had its own opinions on women and sex. Virginity wasn't just a social virtue, it was a spiritual superpower. The Virgin Mary wasn't just a role model, she was the ideal. Chaste, pure, silent. Saints and mystics often described their bodies as temples, their sexuality as a battleground where they fought off temptation with fasting, prayer, and, in extreme cases, self-mutilation. Because apparently that was holier than being a wife. There's one story, sad, strange, and entirely medieval, about a girl who cut off her nose and lips to make herself unattractive to potential suitors so she could devote herself to God. Her contemporaries didn't call her unstable, they called her a saint. Because that's what counted, not living well or safely, but dying chaste. You pass another house now, quieter, darker. A young woman sits alone spinning wool. She's unmarried and past 20, practically ancient by local standards. The neighbours whisper about her. Maybe she's cursed, maybe she's barren, maybe she just doesn't want to end up like her sisters, worn down to the bone by 20 years of birthing and burying babies. She won't say. But her eyes follow you as you pass, and they say plenty. There were exceptions, of course. Some women found ways to push back. Some ran away, joined convents, or claimed religious visions to escape marriage. Others used wealth, wit, or family connections to set their own terms. But for the most part, being female in the medieval world meant being watched, weighed, and too often, owned. The moon rises higher, casting pale light across the village fields. Somewhere in the distance, another wedding feast has begun. Music, clapping, wine. But beneath the joy is a question few here dare ask out loud. What does it mean to call someone wife if she never got to choose? And what kind of love can grow in a garden planted with silence? You've seen how the church defined sin, how peasants fumbled through desire, and how nobles romanticised it to death. But now you're stepping into the shadowed corners of medieval belief, the space where lust wasn't just frowned upon or punished. It was feared. Feared like disease, feared like fire, feared like something crawling up from the deepest pit of hell. Tonight, you walk the thin line between temptation and terror, and the voice you'll keep hearing, The devil made you do it. You're in a modest chapel now, the kind built with more hope than stone. The priest, red-faced and sweating under his robe, is shouting about demons. Not the fun Halloween kind, but the real ones. Incubi and succubi. Spirits of lust. He tells the parishioners that these creatures prowl the earth, whispering foul thoughts into ears, slithering into beds, stealing purity one night at a time. The people sit silently, eyes wide, nodding in fear. No one laughs. They've all had dreams they can't explain. Here's your historical fact. Medieval theology included an entire demonology around sex. Incubi were male demons who seduced or assaulted women in their sleep, and succubi were their female counterparts, luring men into erotic dreams. These weren't just metaphors, they were believed to be real. Some monks argued that incubi could impregnate women with demon spawn. One even warned that those children might become witches or monstrous hybrids. The idea wasn't just that lust led to sin, it was that sin let demons in. And that brings us to the ultimate medieval mood killer, guilt. Every stray thought, every dream soaked in sweat, every involuntary twitch beneath the sheets could be seen as a sign that the devil was winning. You didn't even have to act on your desires, just having them made you suspect. So when someone woke up breathless, ashamed, maybe moaning a name that wasn't their spouse's, they didn't shrug it off. They ran to confession, or tried to ignore it, hoping the devil hadn't noticed. Here's your quirky fact. One 15th century manual for confessors included instructions for interrogating people who claimed to be visited by demons at night. The checklist was extensive. Had they seen the face? Did the demon speak? Did it resemble anyone they knew? Could they feel weight on their chest? Was there any issue of seed during the dream? And if the answer was yes, well, time to fast for 40 days and maybe undergo a quick exorcism. You know, just to be safe. You walk now through a forest path, the trees creaking in the wind. It's quiet but not peaceful. You feel watched, the way someone in the 1300s might feel walking alone at night, with unclean thoughts still fresh in their head. In their worldview, desire wasn't internal, it was external, something trying to enter you, possess you, manipulate you. Lust wasn't your fault, it was your weakness, and the devil was always waiting to exploit it. And yet, despite all the fear, all the sermons, all the fasting and flagellation, lust didn't disappear. It thrived. Quietly, stubbornly. People kept dreaming, kept touching, kept sinning. Which led to one of the biggest theological contradictions of the age. If the devil made you do it, were you still responsible? That's the scholarly debate tonight. Some theologians argued that sexual temptation was part of God's test, and resisting it made you stronger. Others insisted that giving in, even under demonic influence, was still your fault. You had free will after all, but others, especially the mystics, weren't so sure. They believed that certain sins came from forces beyond human control, that you could be good and still be corrupted, that evil could slip through the cracks of your soul while you slept. And if that sounds dark, well, that's the Middle Ages. You didn't get a break just because you were asleep. If you woke up in a cold sweat, thighs sticky, heart racing, you couldn't just chalk it up to a weird dream. No, you might be under attack, spiritually, literally. And if it kept happening, time to call a priest, or worse, the Inquisitors. You reach a stone cottage on the edge of town. A woman lives here alone. She's been accused once, quietly, not formally, of inviting demons into her bed. Why? Because a man saw her in the woods once, picking herbs and humming. Because she's unmarried, because she looks people in the eye, and because her neighbour's son had a strange dream after helping her with firewood. None of this makes sense, but to a medieval mind it fits perfectly. The line between temptation and possession was thin, and women, especially single ones, were seen as doorways to both. Even holy women weren't immune. Stories abound of nuns fighting off demon lovers, battling spiritual attacks in their cells, praying so hard their hair turned white. One nun reportedly levitated during prayer, only to later confess she'd been plagued by nightly visits from an incubus who looked suspiciously like a priest she'd once confessed to. Awkward. You sit now on a stone wall watching the stars blink awake. The wind has shifted, colder. The night feels heavier, and you think about how terrifying it must have been to live in a world where you couldn't trust your own body. Where a twitch, a dream, a warm flush in the wrong moment might be the devil knocking. And yet, despite all the fear and fantasy, people still desired. They still loved. They still risked hell for a few stolen moments of pleasure. Because maybe the devil didn't make them do it. Maybe they did it in spite of the devil. Maybe lust was just human. And maybe that was the scariest idea of all. The chapel bell rings in the distance. Midnight mass, maybe. Or just another warning to keep your thoughts clean and your hands to yourself. You pull your cloak tighter, the shadows move with you, and somewhere nearby, someone dreams something they'll never tell another soul. The morning creeps in cold and cautious, as if it too has something to confess. You're back in the heart of a small town now, its stone buildings pressed together like secrets. The streets are still damp from an early mist, and above the rooftops are church bell tolls, not for mass, not for death, but for shame. Today you witness one of the strangest rituals of medieval life, the public penance parade, part humiliation, part theatre, and all about sin. Sexual sin mostly, because when it came to lust, no one got to suffer in private. You hear them before you see them. A soft murmur, then a chant, and then the slap of bare feet against stone. Turning the corner, you see a procession. A man with a shaved head and a rope belt walks at the front, eyes downcast. Behind him a young woman, barefoot, draped in a shift, hair unbound. Tangled. Symbolic. She's not crying, but she might as well be. The townspeople line the street like spectators at a grim pageant. Some whisper prayers, others just stare. Here's your historical fact. Public penance was a widely used punishment for sins of the flesh. Adultery, fornication, premarital sex, even just rumours of sexual misconduct. The church believed that public shame could purify the soul and restore balance to the community. These parades weren't optional. You could be ordered by an ecclesiastical court to walk through town barefoot, in a rough smock, often with ashes or soot on your head, and sometimes even a placard or symbol advertising your crime. It was like wearing your search history around your neck. You follow the procession as it winds past market stalls and shuttered windows. Some people look away, others smile just a little too smugly. Because nothing quite says I'm holier than thou, like watching someone else take their walk of shame, especially when everyone secretly knows they could be next. Here's your quirky fact. In certain regions of France and Spain, adulterers were made to carry around a fish's tail, sometimes sewn onto their clothes, as a symbol of their slippery morals. Others wore iron collars or were made to kiss the steps of the church in front of a cheering crowd. In England, if you were really unlucky, you might be sentenced to walk naked through the town holding a candle, supposedly to bring your sin into the light. Which, let's be honest, sounds like a punishment invented by someone who just wanted to see their neighbour naked. But here's the thing. The shame wasn't evenly distributed. Men might get fined or walk a short penance route, while women, especially unmarried or lower class ones, faced the full humiliation. This wasn't about justice. It was about spectacle, about reinforcing who held the power and who didn't. Because if lust was a sin, it was always the woman's fault. Ask Eve. You settle now on the steps of the church where the penance procession ends. The woman kneels, the priest appears. He's holding a small book and a heavy expression. Latin prayers spill from his mouth like cold water. Then, without ceremony, he lifts his hand in absolution. The woman is forgiven, spiritually at least. Socially, that's going to take a little longer, and this is where the system gets slippery. Penance was supposed to be cleansing, a chance to start over, but most people didn't forget. Your reputation, once tarnished, tended to stay that way. A woman caught once might struggle to marry. A man might face fewer consequences, unless his sin involved someone else's wife, or resulted in a child, or happened too often to ignore. Which brings us to the scholarly debate. Did public penance actually work as a deterrent? Or was it more about control, keeping the townsfolk in line through fear and humiliation? Some historians argue that the threat of public shame was enough to prevent some people from acting on their desires. Others say that it just drove sex underground, behind locked doors, under haylofts, into the woods. After all, the risk didn't eliminate the urge, it just made it more thrilling. You wander through the marketplace now, past a group of women selling bread and gossip. They're talking about the girl from the penance walk, whether she really did what they say, whether the man involved was a traveller, a married traveller. One woman spits and mutters that the girl brought it on herself. Another says she's just glad it wasn't her daughter. The third only shrugs. She's not the first, she says, won't be the last. You pause at a tavern doorway where two men share a drink. One jokes about the walk of shame, calls it the sinner's parade. His friend laughs, but there's something forced in it. You notice he doesn't meet your gaze. Later that night he'll be knocking on someone's back door, but no one will make him carry a fishtail. Public penance also had layers. Wealthier sinners could sometimes pay for private absolution. Slip a coin into the right palm, and you could skip the ash on the head portion of your redemption arc. Confess quietly, pray silently, sin forgiven. Try again next time. For the poor, no such luck. You had to wear your guilt like a banner and hope the community eventually got bored of judging you. You step into the church now, long empty since the ceremony. It's cool and dim, smelling of damp stone and old incense. A confessional booth creaks in the corner. You picture someone inside, kneeling, whispering. Maybe they're truly remorseful. Maybe they're just scared of being found out. Maybe both. Because in this world, it's not just about what you do, it's about who sees you do it. You sit quietly for a moment, listening. Nothing but the wind, a few birds, the creak of a sign outside. But you can still feel the echo of the procession, the weight of eyes, the sting of shame, the awkward silence that follows public forgiveness. And as you walk back out into the street, you realise something. The church didn't need to burn you to control you. Sometimes, all it took was a pair of bare feet, a crowd of neighbours, and a very long walk. You're not more than a few steps down the street before you start to hear a different kind of noise. Low laughter, clinking cups, a lute playing something that sounds suspiciously upbeat for a Wednesday evening. The penance walk has long ended, but the night hasn't. Not for everyone. You're headed to a different corner of medieval life now, one that's all torchlight and perfume, muddy boots and rouge-stained cheeks. Welcome to the brothel. And no, you're not lost. In fact, if you were a bishop, a nobleman, or just a man with coin and time to kill, this is exactly where you'd be expected to show up eventually. You duck through a side street past a lantern swinging above a red door. It's not officially red. That'll come later, centuries down the line, when red light district becomes a phrase. But the symbolism is already here. That warm glow, that sense of secrecy wrapped in invitation. You push the door open. Inside, the world is softer. Candles burn low. The air is thick with herbs and sweat and something sweet that could be wine or could be deception. Here's your historical fact. Brothels in many medieval European cities weren't just tolerated by the church, they were regulated by it. In places like Paris, London, and even Rome, local governments set rules for where brothels could operate, how much they could charge, and what days they had to stay closed. Good Friday was a no-go, obviously. Some towns even had official brothel inspectors. You heard that right. Men paid to check in on operations, collect fees, and, if rumours are true, occasionally collect more than that. You sit on a bench in the corner, half hidden by velvet drapes that have definitely seen better centuries. Around you, women lounge in gowns that slip just far enough off the shoulder to make it look accidental. They laugh easily, watch carefully. This is their space, and they know how to read every twitch, every hesitation, every wallet. A girl with clever eyes catches yours. She smiles, but not like she means it. Not yet, anyway. Now, here's your quirky fact. In some medieval towns, brothels were actually blessed by the church after they opened. Not because clergy were suddenly chill about sex work, but because they saw it as a necessary evil. Better that men release temptation in a controlled environment, the logic went, than seduce a married woman or defile a virgin. Some theologians even argued that brothels were an act of charity, preventing greater sins by allowing smaller ones. Welcome to the most medieval moral math you'll encounter tonight. You're introduced now to the Madam of the House, a woman with sharp eyes and a laugh that cuts through the smoke like a dagger. She used to work here years ago, but now she runs the place like a noble runs an estate. She knows who owes what, who comes in drunk, who pays too well for it to be love. She also knows the cleric 2 streets over who visits just to talk, and the knight who claims he's celibate but shows up twice a week with a purse full of coin and guilt. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This place is safer for some women than marriage ever was. Sure, there's risk, disease, violence, the constant threat of a raid if the local bishop decides to get pious, but there's also money, a bed, protection from starvation, and a kind of autonomy that most wives never get. The women here can reject a customer. Sometimes They can form alliances. They take care of each other. It's not freedom, but it's a version of it. A crooked one, maybe, but real. You move through the room, past a couple disappearing behind a curtain. A man laughs too loudly. A woman rolls her eyes. You hear a whispered negotiation in one corner. Price, time, conditions. Nothing romantic about it. But then again, not everything in this world pretends to be holy. Some things just are what they are. Which brings us to the scholarly debate. Was the medieval brothel a sign of moral collapse, or a kind of dark stability? Historians can't agree. Some argue that sex work in this period empowered women in limited real ways, offering economic mobility, community, even legal recognition. Others say the system was inherently exploitative, a product of a world where women's bodies were traded like livestock, and both are right. It's complicated. It always is. Upstairs now, the rooms are small and warm. You see candles flickering behind closed doors. The sounds are what you'd expect, and some you wouldn't. Gentle laughter, the rustle of coins, someone softly singing to themselves. You pass a girl barely older than 16, powder on her cheeks, adjusting her bodice in the mirror. She doesn't look at you. She's watching herself, practicing a smile that'll make her evening easier. Maybe she's new, maybe she's just tired. And then you reach a door that's slightly ajar. Inside, a priest, robe still on, is kneeling beside a bed. The woman beside him looks bored. He's praying aloud, half sobbing, asking for forgiveness before they've even done anything. She pats his hand, tells him he's not the first to say that, and probably won't be the last. Back downstairs, the room is filling again. Business picks up after curfew, when respectable people pretend to be asleep, and the unrespectable ones admit they never intended to be. Wine is poured. A song starts up. Someone makes a joke about sinning twice before sunrise. No one laughs too loudly. They all know they'll be in church tomorrow morning, eyes lowered, lips tight. You step out into the night again, the door shutting softly behind you. The sounds of the brothel fade, replaced by the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the distant barking of a dog that's definitely seen too much. You walk back toward the church square and realise, for all the sermons and shame, for all the fear of lust and threats of hell, the brothel still stands, quiet, open, practical. Because even in a world obsessed with sin, the demand for pleasure never really dried up. You leave the brothel behind, its warm candlelight dimming with each step until it's just another shadow in the dark. The streets are quieter now, less laughter, more creaking wood, and distant footsteps echoing like half-whispered secrets. Tonight, you're heading toward what might be the most carefully erased stories of the medieval world, those that didn't fit into the church's neat little binaries. You're walking into a space where love existed between those it wasn't supposed to, where desire moved in ways that frightened priests and confused chroniclers. Welcome to the murky, forbidden realm of same-sex love and heresy hunts. You duck into a small cloister garden, overgrown now with ivy and moss. In one corner, a stone bench is just visible beneath the shadows. Two figures once sat there, close, too close for comfort by medieval standards. Maybe they were monks, lovers bound by silence. Maybe they were young women cloistered in a convent, sharing more than just prayers in the night. Their names weren't recorded, but their feelings? They echoed through the margins of manuscripts in trial records, in letters that survived the fire, folded and hidden and trembling with meaning. Here's your historical fact. While medieval Europe had no clear word for homosexuality as we understand it today, same-sex acts were explicitly condemned by the Church under the category of sodomy, a term so vague it became a catch-all for everything outside acceptable sex, which was, as you've learned, painfully narrow. Penalties range from public penance to mutilation, imprisonment and execution, especially if you were caught more than once. And yet, despite all this, love persisted. It always does. You pass by a monastery's library now, its heavy doors slightly ajar. Inside, parchment rustles and candles flicker. There's a monk, young, maybe too young, copying a text with delicate fingers. He pauses, touches the margin, then sketches a tiny figure. Another monk, smiling. It's fast, secret, and he wipes it away before the ink sets. But for that moment, it existed. That soft rebellion against a world that called his desire a crime. Here's your quirky fact. In the margins of some medieval manuscripts, you can find doodles that suggest far more than innocent fun. Men embracing, women kissing, monks and nuns doing things that would make the bishop drop his goblet. Were these jokes? Fantasies? Confessions? No one can say for sure. But when you consider the strict censorship of the time, the very existence of these images feels like a tiny act of defiance. Back in the garden, you overhear a whispered story, passed between two washerwomen at the river. One of them speaks of a noblewoman who lived alone too long and had too much affection for her handmaid. The other shakes her head, says it's unnatural, but then she goes quiet. There's more to the story, but they both know it's dangerous to say out loud. Not because of the love, but because of who might be listening. Because here's the real terror of same-sex desire in the Middle Ages. Not just that it was punished, but that it was invisible. It wasn't debated the way adultery or premarital sex was. It was denied, buried, turned into heresy. To love someone of your own gender was to risk being labelled not just sinful, but anti-Christian. A threat to the entire divine order. And once that accusation landed, things got ugly fast. You find yourself now in a courtroom, not the fancy marble kind, but a cold wooden hall that smells like damp cloaks and unspoken fear. A man stands in chains. The accusation? Sodomy. He lived alone, dressed too finely, was too close with a younger apprentice. No one saw anything, but suspicions were enough. He's not given a chance to defend himself. Just a list of sins he supposedly committed, and a chance to confess before he's punished. Torture, if needed. Fire, if he refuses. Here's the debate scholars still circle. How common was same-sex love in the Middle Ages, and how much of what we think we know is just projection from later centuries? Some argue that the Church invented much of the panic, twisting male friendships and intense bonds into something monstrous. Others point to letters, poetry and testimonies that suggest real love, sometimes hidden, sometimes celebrated quietly within certain circles. You walk past a convent next, its high stone walls almost humming with silence. Nuns lived closely, prayed closely, slept in neighbouring cells. Some wrote letters filled with language so tender and intense it would make a bishop blush. Take the story of Hildegard of Bingen, the famous mystic. Her letters to a fellow nun, Richardis, are drenched in longing. Were they romantic, spiritual, platonic, but emotionally charged? Historians still argue, but read them closely and they sound like heartbreak. Inside the convent scriptorium, two women sit side by side, heads nearly touching as they translate psalms. One glances at the other, a pause, a smile, and then back to the work. Nothing spoken, nothing written. But the air between them shivers with everything that can't be said, and that's the thing. Most same-sex love in the Middle Ages survived in silences, in shadows, in metaphors. The language didn't exist to describe it safely. You couldn't say you were gay or bisexual or anything else, because those identities didn't officially exist. What you had instead were stories, secrets, longing glances, and sometimes betrayal. You walk now through a village where two young boys used to sneak away at night. They'd lie in the tall grass, whispering, touching hands, dreaming of a life they didn't have words for. One of them grew up, married, had children. The other disappeared. Maybe joined a monastery, maybe ran. The villagers only remember that one stopped smiling. No one ever asks why. The sun is rising now, pink and gold across the rooftops. The town stirs awake. You pass people opening shutters, sweeping steps, going about their lives. Most of them will never say what they feel. Some don't even know how to name it. But in the cracks between the rules, desire still grows. Tangled, beautiful, ungovernable. Because even in a world that burned heretics and exiled the different, love found a way, quietly, carefully, but it never stopped. The sun climbs slowly as you keep walking, the sky shifting from pale rose to a harsher blue. The air feels heavier now, like it's bracing for something, and so are you. Because tonight's road winds toward one of the darkest chapters in the medieval obsession with sex and sin, where fear of desire explodes into full-blown panic and women's bodies become the battlefield. You're about to witness the twisted collision of lust, power, superstition, and suffering. Yes, it's time to talk about witch hunts and the sexual madness that fueled them. You're standing at the edge of a town square and already the crowd is gathering. They're not angry exactly. They're curious, hungry, not for food, but for certainty. someone to blame, someone to punish. A cart creaks into view, and on it is a woman, middle-aged, barefoot, wrists bound. Her hair is wild, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes, they don't flinch. Not yet. Here's your historical fact. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, Europe saw tens of thousands of witch trials. Many resulted in executions, most often by burning or hanging, and while not all of them happened in the Middle Ages proper, the intellectual and theological groundwork for them was laid much earlier. By the late 13th century, the idea of witches as lustful servants of Satan had firmly taken root, and by the 15th century a perfect storm of church paranoia, social anxiety and misogyny turned that fear into frenzy. At the heart of it all? Sex. You step closer, past the guards with their halberds and the priest muttering prayers. The woman on trial today is accused of consorting with the devil. How do they know? Someone said she looked too young for her age. Someone else claimed she caused a cow to miscarry. But the loudest voice, of course, came from a man who once loved her, or said he did. His story. She bewitched him, lured him into sin, made his body betray him in the night. Which brings us to your quirky fact. In many witch trials, women were accused of stealing penises. Yes, you heard that right. A popular belief, spelled out in grim detail, in the infamous 15th century witch-hunting manual, Malleus Maleficarum, was that witches could magically remove a man's genitals and keep them in boxes, feed them like pets, or even hang them from trees. This wasn't symbolic. They meant it literally, and they wrote about it with chilling seriousness. The Malleus, which translates to Hammer of Witches, became the go-to guide for inquisitors, and it's obsessed, truly, disturbingly obsessed, with sex. It argued that women were naturally more lustful, more deceptive, and thus more likely to consort with demons. Witches, it claimed, had sex with Satan, who appeared as a black man, or a dog, or a cloud of smoke, depending on how theatrical the witness felt that day. These demonic unions were said to be both irresistible and horrifying. Pleasure as punishment, ecstasy as evidence. You step into the courtroom now, if you can even call it that. It's more like a room for spectacle, a chair, a bucket of water, maybe some thumbscrews in the corner if the priest gets impatient. The accused woman is questioned, not about evidence but about her dreams, her urges, who she lay with in the dark. She's asked to describe her demonic lover. What position did he prefer? Did he leave marks? Was there issue? The obsession with bodily fluids at these trials was unhealthy, to put it kindly. Here's where the debate among scholars heats up. Were these accusations of sexual witchcraft projections of male anxiety? Was it guilt, wrapped in dogma? Or were they about social control, ways to punish women who didn't fit the mould? Women who were widows, healers, midwives. Women who said no. Women who said too much. Historians argue both sides, but either way, the result was the same. A woman accused of knowing too much about the body, hers or anyone else's, was a threat. And so they tortured. To prove the sin, they used red-hot irons to check for devil's marks, moles, birthmarks, or any patch of skin that didn't feel pain. They shaved heads, scoured genitals, pried for confessions with tools that belonged more in a dungeon than a courtroom. And when the woman finally broke, and she always did, they recorded her words, often dictated through blood and delirium, and called it proof. Back in the square now, the sentence is read. Guilty of lust, of witchcraft, of everything that made men uncomfortable. She doesn't scream, she just stares, and then they lead her to the stake. You stand still. Smoke curls into the sky. People begin to murmur again, not with sympathy, but with relief. One less witch, one more body offered to the god of fear and fire. Some cross themselves, others make crude jokes. She won't tempt anyone now. And here's what no one says out loud. Some of the men in this crowd once desired her, wanted her, maybe even touched her, and now they get to watch her burn and feel righteous doing it. You walk away slowly. The smoke clings to your clothes, to your thoughts. This wasn't about magic. It was about control, about what happens when a society is terrified of female sexuality and too cowardly to admit it. So it creates monsters, and then sets fire to them. In the quiet of the woods just beyond town you find a stream. The water runs clear, cool, indifferent. and you imagine all the women who were never named, never accused, but still walked through life terrified that one slip, one flirtation, one angry lover, one miscarriage could turn them into a target. Because in a world where desire is sin, and sin belongs to the devil, all it takes is one rumour to get burned. You follow the stream through a patch of woods until the trees thin and open into a walled garden. A convent, tucked safely behind thick stone and habit-stitched silence. The air here feels cooler, quieter, like it's trying hard to remember how to be innocent. The gate creaks as you slip inside. You're not here to see sin punished tonight. You're here to see how holiness itself wrestled with desire, how the purest among them weren't always free from longing, and how chastity and the right candlelight sometimes looked a lot like obsession. You're going to meet the holy virgins, and despite their reputations, they have stories full of sweat, dreams, and bodies that don't always behave. You pass rows of herbs and tidy beds of lavender and sage. A few nuns tend the garden, sleeves rolled up, faces shaded beneath their wimples. From a second-story window, soft singing drifts down, a hymn, but with a melody that aches. These women have taken vows of chastity, poverty, obedience. They've turned their backs on the flesh. Or at least they've tried. Here's your historical fact. In many medieval convents, women were encouraged to develop intense emotional and spiritual relationships with Christ, often described in deeply physical language. Some nuns wrote about their union with God using terms that blurred the line between mysticism and eroticism. Visions of Christ as a bridegroom were common. So were metaphors of wounds, kisses, and bodily union, not just spiritual ecstasy, but emotional and sometimes very sensory rapture. You step inside the chapel and feel the hush of devotion wrap around you. A young nun kneels in the front pew, hands clasped, face flushed. She's not just praying, she's trembling. Later, you'll learn she's had a vision. Christ appeared to her, bleeding, radiant, open-armed. He told her she was his bride. He touched her hand. She swears she felt his breath on her skin. When she describes it to the abbess, her voice shakes. She doesn't use the word pleasure, but it's there, in the pauses. Now for your quirky fact, St. Lutgardis, a 13th century mystic, claimed that Christ visited her in her cell and pressed his heart to hers, literally, physically. She described the sensation as so intense she couldn't breathe. Another nun, St. Gertrude the Great, wrote of Christ inviting her to rest her head between his wounds, whispering secrets in her ear like a lover. Their writings are laced with passionate imagery, full of desire disguised as divine favour. You walk now into the scriptorium, where a few nuns copy texts by hand. It's quiet except for the scratch of quills. One woman stares too long at the page before her. She's copying the Song of Songs, that famously sensual, metaphor-heavy book of the Bible. "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth," she writes, then pauses. Her quill hovers. She bites her lip. Maybe it's the candlelight, but her cheeks look warmer than the room. 'Cause here's the thing. Just because a woman took a vow didn't mean her body stopped existing. Desire didn't dissolve. It found new forms. In some cases, it got directed entirely toward Christ, recast as holy longing. In other cases, it spilled over into relationships between sisters, intimate, emotional, sometimes physical. Historians debate the extent. Letters exist, poems, a few diary fragments. Mostly it was quiet, but it happened. You pass through a narrow hallway now, the walls lined with faded paintings. One shows St. Agnes embracing a glowing figure. Another, St. Catherine in ecstasy, head thrown back, mouth parted. These weren't just portraits. They were instructions, models, show devotion, show suffering, show love, but only upward, not sideways. And when desire crossed the line, things got complicated. One convent in southern France was accused in the 14th century of housing unruly sisters. The records say they bathed together. They refused to sleep in separate beds. They were caught whispering late into the night, giggling like girls, and, this part written carefully, engaging in conduct unbecoming of their office. The abbess was replaced. The convent reformed. The details were scrubbed, but the whispers never left. Now here's the scholarly debate that still stirs up awkward conferences. Were these mystics truly experiencing divine love, or were they channeling their repressed desires into spiritual language because it was the only safe way to speak about it? Was a nun's vision of Christ kissing her feet just devotion, or a displaced longing for touch? And more importantly, does it matter? The answer seems to be yes, and also number. You peek into one of the cells, a small stone room with a narrow cot, a crucifix and a single candle. A journal lies open. You can't help but read. Tonight, I dreamed again. His eyes burned like stars. His hands. I cannot describe his hands. He called me his beloved. I awoke weeping. My body ached. You close the book gently. This isn't lust in the way brothel owners or poets write about. This is something else, something tangled, a kind of hunger that's both holy and very, very human. Outside again, the nuns are singing in the garden, the sky softening, the sun caught in the curve of the stone wall, and for a moment everything feels still. But under that stillness something pulses, a heartbeat, a longing, not sinful, not saintly, just real. Because in the medieval convent, even with walls so thick and rules so strict, desire still lived. It just wore a veil. You leave the convent walls behind, stepping back out into a world where flesh and faith are constantly in argument, and flesh usually wins. But tonight, you're not just looking at desire as a moral problem, you're going to feel it, literally. Because in the medieval world, sex wasn't some elegant abstraction or discreet affair behind bed curtains. It was a full-body, five senses experience, and frankly, not always a pleasant one. You're about to explore what medieval people smelled, tasted, touched, and heard when they got down to it. Welcome to the awkward, aromatic, and sometimes unwashed reality of sex in the Middle Ages. You're in a small cottage now, wood smoke curling from the hearth and something vaguely cabbagey drifting from a pot in the corner. A couple lies tangled under a rough wool blanket. Their bed is a wooden frame stuffed with straw and occasionally livestock. Yes, you read that right. Chickens underfoot, a goat tied near the hearth. And between the animal funk and a serious lack of plumbing, the central ambience is complicated. Here's your historical fact. Bathing wasn't absent from medieval life, but it was limited by class, season, and access to clean water. Public bathhouses were more common than people think, especially in cities, and were often mixed gender, with steamy rooms, hot water, and plenty of unsupervised touching. But for peasants, regular washing meant dousing yourself with cold well water, maybe once a week, and only if it wasn't winter. That means when it came to sex, most bodies came to the bed already carrying a cocktail of sweat, soot, and stale ale. And here's your quirky fact. Medieval physicians actually believed that strong body odour, particularly from men, could be an aphrodisiac. They thought the sweat of a virile man could stimulate the womb. Some love manuals even suggested skipping the bath to make your natural musk more compelling, which sure might explain a lot of the weird choices in medieval love poems. You walk now into the chambers of a noblewoman. Her bed is draped in fine linen, the floor strewn with rushes that were supposed to keep things fresh, but mostly just trapped more smells. She's dabbed her wrists with a scented oil, probably made from rosewater, cloves, and rancid animal fat because perfume chemistry wasn't exactly refined yet. Her lover arrives wearing layers of velvet and zero deodorant. They embrace. Somewhere beneath the candlelight and whispered vows, a rat skitters across the floorboards. Romance. This is where touch takes over. And let's be honest, medieval sex wasn't cushioned by satin sheets and feather pillows. Mattresses were lumpy, bed frames creaked like wounded animals, and there was no such thing as privacy. You'd hear the neighbours, and they'd hear you. Families often shared single-room homes. Newlyweds got married and immediately went to bed, sometimes with their in-laws in the same room. Talk about performance pressure. You pause now in a townhouse, peeking into an upper room where a young couple is cautiously exploring each other's bodies. He's learned about anatomy from a priest who used the word seed, like it was a terrifying curse. She's been told her womb is a cold, damp cave that needs warming by male heat. No one has explained what to expect, and so they fumble, hoping instinct will do the work. It does. Sort of. Here's the scholarly debate. How much did medieval people really know about the physical mechanics of sex? We know that texts existed, medical treatises, marital handbooks, even erotic poems. But who read them, and who understood them? Some argue that rural people figured it out through experience and gossip, while elites had access to more detailed, though often hilariously inaccurate manuals. Others believe ignorance was the norm, and that most sexual encounters were shaped more by trial and error than actual instruction. Now let's talk sound. Medieval towns weren't quiet, and neither were the bedrooms. Wooden walls offered little protection, and moaning wasn't exactly discreet. But what about when things got theatrical? Well, some sources mention songs, lovers serenading each other before or after sex. Others talk about dirty rhymes passed between women, or crude jokes told by midwives. There was a whole subculture of erotic language, filled with euphemisms, metaphors, and the occasional downright baffling reference to farm tools. And then there's taste. Brace yourself. Some medieval love potions were intended to be consumed right before sex, typically a mix of honey, herbs, and unfortunate animal bits. One, aphrodisiac, involved goat milk, crushed beetles, and wine. Another recommended dried boar testicles. And if that didn't work, you could always try applying ointments to sensitive areas. Let's just say there were a lot of tingling sensations, and not always the fun kind. You pass a bathhouse now, steam rising from the roof, muffled laughter and slapping sounds from inside. The church tried to crack down on places like this, especially when they blurred the line between bathing and brothling. But people still came, seeking warmth, connection, and occasionally something more. The bathhouse was a social equalizer, a place where nobles and merchants might share a tub, and sometimes a partner. But for all this sensory chaos, medieval people still found moments of true intimacy. A stolen touch under the feast table, a whispered joke as the door closed, a shared cloak in winter, pressed so close you couldn't tell where your shivering ended and theirs began. It wasn't always elegant. Often it was messy, awkward, noisy, but it was real. You stop now beneath a tavern window. A couple inside is giggling. Someone knocks over a mug, a chair scrapes, and then the unmistakable thump of boots hitting the floor as someone decides finally to get comfortable. You smile, not because it's romantic, but because it's familiar. For all the centuries that divide you, bodies haven't changed. Lust is still a warm hand in the cold, a terrible poem whispered into a neck, a need that doesn't care about theology or hygiene or whether the hay pokes. And as you keep walking, the wind carries 100 smells: bread baking, dung steaming, wood smoke rising. Somewhere in there, if you really try, you can catch the scent of sex. Not perfume, not passion. Just the musk of bodies in motion, in heat, in need. You leave behind the smells of town, the layered bouquet of bread crusts, horse dung, and marital compromise, and wander into a quieter part of the countryside, where the wind moves through the hedges and old secrets hang low over the grass. Tonight you're not following priests or poets, you're following whispers. Because while the church tried to trap sex in rules and rituals, the people had their own magic. Bedroom superstitions, love charms, and just enough folk wisdom to make you question whether that weird neighbour with all the cats really was just lonely. This is the world of medieval sexual folklore and bedroom magic, where love didn't always come from fate or flirting. It came from a boiled root, a whispered word, or a suspiciously accurate potion passed down through generations. And if it didn't work, well, there was always a curse to fix the problem. You step into the hut of an old woman perched on the edge of the village. Her fire burns low, herbs hang from the rafters. She greets you with a look that knows what you came for, and she's seen it before. A young girl, cheeks flushed, asking for a charm to make the tanner's son fall in love. A wife, desperate to rekindle her husband's affection after a long Lent and a longer silence. A man too ashamed to speak, but willing to pay for something that will make things work better. She has something for all of them. Whether it works, that's not the point. Here's your historical fact. Medieval folk medicine and magic were full of sexual remedies and rituals. From love potions to impotence cures, the line between medicine and magic was often invisible. You might rub nettle leaves on your thighs to excite the blood, or eat baked sparrow hearts for virile strength. Potions were made from things like wolf liver, powdered oyster shells, and, charmingly, menstrual blood. It wasn't just superstition, it was science, as far as many people were concerned. And if it didn't work, maybe the dosage was off, or the stars were wrong. Speaking of which, here's your quirky fact. Some medieval folks believed your astrological sign affected your sexual compatibility. A Virgo paired with a Sagittarius? Risky. A Pisces with a Taurus? Steamy. Love manuals included planetary charts to help you choose the best day to seduce your beloved. Tuesdays were ruled by Mars, too aggressive. Fridays, Venus's day, were ideal for love spells. It's astrology meets medieval Tinder, and it involved more chickens than you'd expect. Back in the hut, the old woman hands you a bundle of herbs. Put this under your pillow, she says. Dream of the one who will love you. It smells like mint, lavender, and something unidentifiable. Maybe mugwort. Maybe hope. You thank her. You don't ask for your change. You wander now through the village, past cottages where candles burn low, and someone is definitely trying something they read in a copied grimoire. A man ties 9 knots in a red thread, muttering the name of his beloved with each twist. A girl slips a coin she touched with her tongue into her crush's ale. If he drinks it and looks her way, it's love. If he spits it out, well, there's a hex for that too. You hear footsteps in the dark. 2 lovers meet behind the chapel, pressing close beneath the window of the very priest who would banish them if he knew. But just before their hands wander, the girl pulls out a charm, a silver coin wrapped in wool. For protection, she whispers. You're not sure if she means contraception or concealment. Maybe both. Either way, it's working for now. Of course, all this folk magic came with risks. If your love spell backfired, people might say you were a witch. If your neighbour's cow stopped giving milk right after you were seen collecting rainwater naked under the full moon, well, let's just say your life expectancy dipped. Sexual magic blurred the line between desire and danger. People feared it, envied it, and blamed it for everything from infertility to adultery. Here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Were these folk practices genuine beliefs, or just cultural theatre? Some argue that love potions and rituals were real tools, used with sincere faith in their power. Others suggest they were performance, part of the social game, a way to flirt, to manipulate, or to express longing when words failed. And some, of course, think it was both. Because sometimes just believing something works is enough to make it real. You sit now in a barn listening to an old man tell a story to a wide-eyed boy. It's about a woman who once stole her husband's virility by burying a bone under his bed. He didn't know what was wrong, only that he could no longer perform his husbandly duties. Until one night he dreamed of a fox with her face, and when he dug under the bed the next morning, there it was. The boy asks, "What happened next?" The old man grins. He hid a horseshoe in her pillowcase. She never looked at another man again. Are these just stories? Probably. But stories have power, especially in a world where real power is scarce. You walk on, and the moon rides high. Somewhere a woman drops wax drippings into water to divine the face of her future lover. Somewhere else, a jealous wife boils a lock of her rival's hair in wine, chanting quietly under her breath. And yes, somewhere, a man is rubbing ground stag antler on his thighs because his cousin swore it worked like magic, which it doesn't. But desperation has never been picky. You stop now at the edge of a field where a scarecrow stands watch in the moonlight. Someone's tied a bit of red cloth to its arm. A love spell, maybe, a curse, or just a prank. But in the medieval world, all those things live close together. Sex wasn't just about the body, it was about mystery, about control, about the hope that, with the right herb or word or whisper, you could make someone love you, or at least want you, without asking twice. Because when doctrine failed and desire refused to be contained, magic stepped in with a wink and a grin and said, "Let's try anyway." The sky lightens a little as you walk, not quite dawn, not quite night. That strange in-between time where everything feels quiet, but the air hums with unanswered questions. You've seen how medieval people tangled with lust through ritual, punishment and magic. But now you're going to sit in on something even more chaotic. Medieval sex education, or more accurately the loud, confused mumbling that tried to pass as education. Tonight, you're entering the world of mumbled theories, questionable anatomy, and diagrams that look like nightmares drawn by candlelight. Welcome to medieval sex ed, proudly misinformed since the 12th century. You begin your lesson in a university hall somewhere in Paris or Bologna, where the air is thick with chalk dust and unearned confidence. A professor in voluminous robes paces at the front of the room, gesturing wildly at a board where he's drawn what he claims is the female reproductive system. It looks like a sad pair of bellows with a crown on top. He explains with authority that women have wandering wombs, which float freely around the body, sometimes causing hysteria, migraines, or inconvenient fits of lust. No one laughs. They're taking notes. Here's your historical fact. Many medieval physicians believed that the uterus could literally move inside the body, rising toward the throat, descending toward the feet, depending on a woman's emotional or physical state. This idea, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, led to treatments like fumigation, using scented smoke near the genitals to coax the womb back into place, and, in some truly bewildering cases, marriage and pregnancy as cures for uterine anxiety. Yes, this was real. No, it didn't work. You flip through one of the professor's treasured texts, maybe a copy of De Secretis Mulierum on the secrets of women. It's written in Latin, of course, and makes bold claims. That women are naturally colder than men, that their seed is weaker, and that conception can only occur if both parties orgasm. This last part, ironically, was supposed to protect women from rape accusations, because you see, if she got pregnant, clearly she must have enjoyed it. That's the logic. You may now scream into a medieval pillow. In the next classroom over, a monk-turned-medical scholar is giving a lecture on male anatomy. He speaks reverently about humours, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, and how their balance determines a man's temperament and, more importantly, his sexual appetite. Too much black bile, he's melancholy and uninterested. Too much blood, he's hot-blooded and, well, over-enthusiastic. The prescription, a bland diet, cold baths, and prayer. The students scribble this down with furrowed brows, all while adjusting their robes very casually. Here's your quirky fact. There was a belief in medieval medical circles that a man could run out of semen if he wasn't careful, because semen was considered concentrated blood, and therefore a limited, precious resource. Frequent ejaculation wasn't just frowned upon, it was seen as physically weakening. Some writers even claimed it could cause blindness, early aging, and a loss of masculinity. You didn't just risk hell, you risked anemia, apparently. Now we enter the realm of helpful advice, usually given to women, unsolicited by men who've never seen a naked woman outside a tapestry. One text advises women to drink wine made with eagle feathers to increase fertility. Another warns that sex during a full moon could result in children born with extra fingers. And don't even get started on left-handedness, red hair, or children conceived during thunderstorms, all considered signs of unnatural lust or bad luck. You sit now in a small village, watching a midwife explain how babies happen to a group of teenage girls. She uses bread dough to demonstrate swelling bellies, and a wooden spoon to explain penetration. Her metaphors are vivid and deeply confusing. The man's seed is like yeast, she says. It makes the loaf rise. One girl snorts, another turns pale, a third stares, fascinated. Is it medically accurate? Not even close. Is it better than what they're learning from the priest? Absolutely. And this brings us to the scholarly debate. How widespread was sexual knowledge in the Middle Ages? Some argue that people knew more than we give them credit for, learned through observation, gossip, and trial and error. Others believe that widespread illiteracy, combined with religious censorship, kept people dangerously misinformed. There's truth on both sides. A noblewoman might have access to medical texts written by Galen or Avicenna, though translated 3 times and mangled by monks. A peasant might learn everything from a grandmother who used sheep gut for contraception and swore garlic under the tongue prevented pregnancy. It didn't. You peek into a married couple's home now. The husband thinks he knows how conception works. He's been told he has to be on top, because otherwise the seed might leak out or travel backward. The wife has no illusions about his expertise but goes along with it, because she's been told that if she enjoys it too much, the child might be born a sinner. They both finish confused. No one mentions love. Some of this misinformation, to be fair, was harmless, silly even, but some of it was deadly. Women died during childbirth because no one understood hygiene. Men believed impotence was caused by witchcraft and tortured women for it. Contraception, while not entirely unknown, was unreliable and frowned upon. And the lack of basic sexual knowledge turned many natural events, wet dreams, menstrual cycles, infertility, into terrifying mysteries explained only by sin or spirits. You find a student now, alone in the corner of a monastery library. He's reading a banned text, maybe an Arabic medical manuscript smuggled from Spain, filled with illustrations that make his ears burn. It describes clitorises, talks about pleasure, even suggests that female sexuality is not only real, but important. He glances around nervously. He'll copy down the diagrams later, hide them in his robes, and pretend he doesn't dream about the girl he saw at the market. Because here's the paradox. In a world where knowledge was locked away, desire found its own teachers, in stories, in songs, in accidents and experiments, People learned despite the books, not because of them. Sex education, if you could call it that, was a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and the rest jammed into the wrong places. As you leave the classroom, the professor calls out, "And remember, children born under Mars are prone to lust." The students nod solemnly. You just shake your head, because in this world everyone's an expert, and no one knows a damn thing. You're back on the road again, though this time it doesn't feel like a walk so much as a slow, uneasy descent. The sun's behind you now, the landscape turning a little more hostile, the ground muddier, the trees darker, the air thick with something not quite right. Lust in the medieval mind was already a dangerous force, but when that force was projected beyond human boundaries, into beasts, fantasies, and unholy urges, things got a whole lot darker. Tonight you're stepping into a medieval mind that feared not just desire, but the animal inside it. Yes, it's time to talk about bestiality. And trust me, it's weirder, sadder, and more theological than you're ready for. Let's get your historical fact out of the way quickly. Bestiality, sexual acts between humans and animals, was not just seen as unnatural, but as one of the most damnable offences in medieval Europe. Along with heresy and sodomy, it ranked among the crimes that cried out to heaven. In canon law and secular codes alike, it carried horrifying punishments: execution, mutilation, and often the killing of the animal involved. Sometimes that animal was even put on trial, sentenced, and ceremonially executed. Not joking. They'd build a gallows for a pig. You walk through a small village now, and sure enough, there's a case to be whispered about. A shepherd, maybe. A goat. No one wants to say it outright, but they all know what the bishop's men found last week. The man's gone now, taken in chains, head down. But the goat? Still here. The local priest is deciding whether it needs to be cleansed or killed. It sounds absurd. It is absurd. But in the medieval worldview, the boundaries between man, beast, and devil were dangerously thin. Here's your quirky fact, and it's a weird one. Some medieval bestiaries, the illustrated animal encyclopedias of the time, were basically erotic warning posters. They described animals with terrifyingly seductive powers. The weasel, for example, was believed to conceive through the mouth and give birth through the ear, don't ask. The hyena was said to mimic human speech to lure travellers into its lair. And don't even get started on the unicorn, whose horn was supposedly attracted only to virgins, making it the medieval poster child for dangerously sexy animals. All of this speaks to a deeper fear, that lust could turn you into something less than human, that giving in to carnal urges made you a creature. And if you crossed that line, literally or metaphorically, society would treat you like one. So bestiality wasn't just a physical crime, it was a moral collapse, a transformation, an admission that you'd surrendered to the beast inside. You step into a rural church now, where a priest reads aloud from Leviticus, voice shaking as he thunders about abominations. He's not talking about anything specific, of course, but everyone here knows who he's thinking of. They remember what the shepherd's mother said about how he was always strange with animals, how he never looked a woman in the eye. And they remember last year too, when that boy was caught near the river with a chicken and said the devil made him do it. He's buried on the edge of the graveyard now, unmarked. This is where the scholarly debate begins. Historians aren't arguing whether these acts happened. There's enough documentation, sadly, to confirm that. What they're debating is how often they happened versus how often they were used as accusations, especially against people seen as outsiders, mentally ill or sexually different. Bestiality became a catch-all charge. Couldn't understand a person? They must be depraved. Didn't like someone? Say you saw them in the barn after dark. In a society obsessed with purity, the quickest way to destroy someone was to animalize them. You pass a barn now, and for a moment the normal life of the village continues around it. Children playing, women tending to sheep. But the barn feels different, off, like the weight of accusation lingers there. And maybe it always will. Because even if the shepherd never returns, people don't forget. Especially not this. It's easy to laugh at the absurd parts, the goat trials, the execution of pigs, the idea of a seductive snake whispering dirty talk. But underneath the comedy is something darker. The church and the state weren't just punishing deviants. They were drawing hard lines around what made a person human. Bestiality wasn't about animals. It was about fear of regression, of crossing into the space where instinct overpowers reason, where the soul is quiet and only the body speaks. And the church had ideas about where those instincts came from. Surprise, it's the devil again. In many theological texts, bestiality was framed as demonic temptation, especially among monks. If a monk felt drawn to animals, even slightly, it might be proof he was under Satan's influence. One monk in a 14th century German text confessed to dreaming of a dog licking him. His abbot beat him, exorcised him, then wrote about it in his journal as a warning to others. You walk now with a friar on the outskirts of a town. He's collecting tithes, but he pauses to lecture a young boy about avoiding temptation. The devil knows your weakness, he says, and he doesn't always come with horns. The boy nods, clearly scared. He's 12. What weaknesses does he have? Watch the animals, the friar adds. They know more than they show. You stare at the man, wondering how someone could believe that, and yet in this world it's entirely logical. If lust is a gateway, and animals live in instinct, then the path between the two must be dangerously short. As the day fades, you stop at a crossroads. Fields on all sides, a barn in the distance, and a shrine to the Virgin Mary placed just so. A protection, a boundary, a whispered prayer not just against famine or wolves, but against whatever thing lives in the dark corners of human nature. The thing that's not quite human, the thing that might be watching. The wind picks up. A dog barks once, then again. And somewhere, a man tries to fall asleep with the weight of something he's done, or been accused of, pressing down on his chest. Because in a world that sees desire as monstrous, the only question is what kind of beast it turns you into. You walk fast now, trying to shake off the barnyard dread, the torchlit eyes of a crowd hungry for someone else's fall. You need something lighter, not necessarily safer. Nothing in the medieval mind about sex is safe, but at least more absurd. So tonight, you're diving headfirst into one of the strangest objects of the Middle Ages' collective imagination, the chastity belt. Equal parts metal, myth, and misplaced anxiety, it's the ultimate symbol of medieval sexual control. Except, possibly, it never really existed. Or it did. Kind of. Maybe. Welcome to the bizarre, buckle-heavy debate over whether people actually strapped these things on for real. You're standing in a dusty armory, sunlight filtering in through stained glass windows that weren't designed to illuminate steel underpants. But here we are. Hanging from a hook, next to a flail and a dented helmet, is it? A rusted iron contraption shaped vaguely like a pair of shorts, with an unfortunate-looking lock at the front. The museum guide, if there were such a thing in 1450, claims it was used to preserve virtue. You squint at it. You're not sure if it's more terrifying or hilarious. Let's kick off with your historical fact. Chastity belts do appear in later medieval and early Renaissance art and texts, usually as symbols of virtue, fidelity, or the laughably impossible task of controlling female sexuality. But the actual physical objects we have, all those intimidating iron relics, mostly date from the 16th century or later. Some are even proven 19th century fakes, created to feed Victorian imaginations about the kinky, backward, sex-obsessed Middle Ages. In short, the chastity belt might be one of the biggest medieval myths people still believe. But before you write it off entirely, let's look closer. There are passing references to girdles of chastity in some texts. Poems, sermons, moral instruction manuals. Most scholars agree these were likely metaphorical. The idea was that a good woman wore chastity like armour, not that she literally bolted her genitals shut. And yet, the myth grew. Somewhere between anxiety, humour, and an unhealthy obsession with controlling female desire, people started imagining and eventually building devices designed to make lust physically impossible. Here's your quirky fact. One 15th century poem jokingly describes a knight giving his wife a key to her chastity belt, lest she grow bored while he's away. The punchline: she immediately gives the key to her lover. The whole thing is a satire. But that didn't stop later readers from treating it like an instruction manual. Medieval humour, it turns out, doesn't age gracefully when taken literally. You wander through a noblewoman's chamber now. Her husband is preparing to leave on a pilgrimage. He's solemn, dramatic, acting like he's marching off to die, when really he's just going to drink wine and look pious in Jerusalem. As a final gesture, he presents her with a silk-bound box. Inside, not a belt, but a symbolic gift. Maybe a brooch, shaped like a lock. Maybe a ring with an inscription. Keep yourself as I keep faith. The message is clear, but the hardware is metaphorical, mostly. Here's where the scholarly debate heats up. Did anyone actually wear chastity belts in the Middle Ages? Most historians say no, at least not in the way people imagine. They argue that the logistics don't add up. Hygiene, comfort, infection risks, and the simple impracticality of strapping sharp metal to your thighs for days or weeks at a time. The belts you see in museums are more likely later creations, intended to shock or amuse. But some fringe scholars argue that temporary versions might have been used, soft belts with padlocks, worn briefly, during festivals or as part of bizarre marriage rituals. A kind of medieval cosplay, if you will. You pass a market stall now where a travelling bard is telling a bawdy tale. A merchant's wife, left alone, is supposedly fitted with a chastity belt. Her lover, a blacksmith, makes a key. The punchline involves too many locks, a lot of sweating, and a rooster that crows every time the belt is tampered with. The crowd roars. They're not shocked, they're entertained. Chastity belts are funny, because no one actually wears one. And yet, the idea persists. Not because it worked, but because it fed the fantasy of control. For a man in a society where women's bodies were considered both sacred and dangerously erotic, the thought of locking her up offered a kind of psychological comfort. You could go to war or on pilgrimage without wondering what she might do while you're gone. Never mind that many women, left behind, were running estates, fighting off bandits, and handling 3 children and a crop rotation. You duck into a shadowed alley where a woman lifts her skirt, not to seduce, but to relieve herself behind a barrel. There's no iron contraption, no padlocks, just a tired glance and a quiet sigh. The myth of the chastity belt always ignored the reality of women's lives. Hard work, constant watchfulness, and very little room for nonsense. If you asked the average medieval wife whether she'd wear an iron undergarment to stay faithful, she'd probably tell you to take a long walk off a short parapet. Still, the imagery survives. In manuscripts and woodcuts, you see smug husbands holding giant keys, wives looking bored, locks dangling from garters like fashion accessories. In some plays, a chastity belt becomes a visual gag, like a prop that says, "She's untouchable," but probably not for long. The belt wasn't real, but the idea of it was real enough to spark desire, laughter, and more than a few control fantasies. As the night deepens, you find yourself standing before a statue of the Virgin Mary, carved in alabaster. She's serene, untouchable, pure. The ultimate chastity belt in a way. One that wasn't worn on the body but imposed on the soul. Women were expected to emulate her, always available for veneration, never for desire. And when they failed, when they had lovers, children, needs, the world pretended it was a betrayal rather than a biological certainty. You smile bitterly. Somewhere, a man is locking up his wine, his horses, and probably his wife's letters. Somewhere else, a young girl is being told to keep herself, but lust doesn't wear keys, and desire laughs at metal. Because whether the chastity belt was myth or rare reality, it was never the lock that mattered. It was the fear behind it, and the body that refused to stay silent beneath it. You walk on, but your steps feel slower now, not from weariness, but from the heaviness of what's coming next. You've seen how desire was feared, punished, joked about, locked away in iron or ritual. But tonight, we step into the flesh and blood consequences of all that repression and recklessness. Lust wasn't just a spiritual danger, it was a physical one. In a world where nobody really understood germs or hygiene, sex had a very real, very painful cost. Welcome to the fevered beds, foul remedies, and social panic of diseases of desire, where you didn't just risk your soul, you risked everything from blindness to black boils in unfortunate places. The alley you enter is narrow, grimy, and wet with yesterday's rain. There's a man curled against the wall, rocking slowly, a hood drawn low over his face. No one gets too close. You notice the sores on his mouth, the blotchy skin, the way he clutches at himself. Not from modesty, but from pain. A few steps away, someone mutters, "God's punishment." And just like that, the diagnosis is spiritual. Here's your historical fact. Sexually transmitted infections weren't fully understood in the Middle Ages, but they were present. The most notorious, of course, was syphilis, though historians argue over whether it truly appeared in Europe during the late medieval period or just exploded into greater visibility after the voyages to the New World. What's clear is that by the late 15th century, a new and terrifying disease was spreading, marked by pustules, rotting flesh, neurological damage, and a trail of broken bodies behind it. People called it the Great Pox, and while it wasn't exclusively spread by sex, sex was blamed for most of it. You pass a makeshift infirmary now, really just a barn converted to hold the sick. Inside, a nun tends to a patient with trembling hands. She's not a doctor, there aren't many of those anyway, but she knows the signs. Swollen groin, sores that won't heal, painful urination. He begs her for relief. She offers a mix of herbs, vinegar and prayer. It won't help, but it's all they have. And now for your quirky fact. Some medieval treatments for sexual disease included drinking mercury, smearing yourself with arsenic-based ointments, or inserting metal tubes into the urethra to clear blockages. If the cure didn't kill you, the side effects did. Tremors, hallucinations, madness. But hey, at least you were no longer sinning. You were just dying. Slowly. You move through the street now past a group of men laughing too loud at a joke that isn't funny. One of them limps, another scratches constantly. They glance nervously toward the leper house at the edge of town. That's where they send the worst cases, whether it's leprosy, syphilis, or just something that looks suspicious. Once you're in, you don't come back out. Which brings us to the real sickness, the shame. Because in medieval Europe, disease wasn't just biological, it was moral. If you caught something down there, it was proof that you'd sinned. No one asked if your husband was faithful. No one cared if it was passed to you without consent. The punishment fell on the infected, and usually the infected were poor, powerless, and already blamed for other things. You stop now in a brothel, quieter than usual. One of the women, no older than 20, has been confined to a back room. She's been coughing blood. Her skin is blotched. Her clients have stopped coming. The madam, once stern, now sits beside her with a cup of weak wine. She used to have a name, Marjorie or Joan or something soft. Now people just call her the sick one. She was once someone's daughter, maybe someone's love, and now she's rotting from the inside out. And here's where the scholarly debate breaks open. Was the explosion of disease in the later medieval period the result of increased sexual activity, or just better, read more terrified documentation? Some argue that urbanization, war and migration increased exposure. Others point out that the real danger wasn't more sex, it was more judgment. People who might have hidden illness were dragged into the light, accused, punished. Some scholars suggest the panic was always more moral than medical. After all, you couldn't burn lust out of someone's soul, but you could publicly humiliate the person who got sick from it. You pass a university now, where a lecturer is explaining that syphilis is caused by corrupted humours, or excessive desire. He draws diagrams. He warns his students not to indulge in too much wine, meat, or women. Meanwhile, two of them sneak off during lunch to visit the bathhouse. Everyone knows someone who's gotten the fever. Everyone swears it won't happen to them. And yet, here you are. You hear coughing in the alley again, louder now, desperate. Someone is praying, softly, fervently. You catch only the end. If I'm spared, I'll never touch her again. But you know that's not true. Not because he's lying, but because he's human. Lust isn't logical. It doesn't read medical texts. It doesn't remember what happened to the last man who got too close. You pass a church where sinners kneel in the shadows. Some are there for forgiveness. Others, because they think the priest might know a treatment the doctors don't. Holy water. A relic. A scrap of the true cross pressed to a lesion. And when none of that works, they blame the women. Or the Jews, or the foreigners. Anyone but themselves. And here's the part that truly stings. The people who needed compassion got condemnation. The people who needed care were abandoned. And the people who profited from sex, landlords, clergy, city officials, simply found someone else to rent the room. As the wind picks up and the sickroom doors close for the night, you realise that in the medieval world, disease wasn't just a punishment. It was a story others told about you, a story you carried in your body, a story that ended the same way, whether it began in love, loneliness, or the back room of a brothel. Because in a time without cures, the body became the battlefield, and lust always left its mark. The sun's finally up again, pale and watery, as if it's not quite ready to commit to another day of watching what people get up to. You find yourself in a scriptorium now, quiet, warm, the scent of ink and vellum thick in the air. Rows of monks lean over their desks, copying, illuminating, pretending not to notice the occasional risky doodle slipping in between the margins. Because for all the churches railing against sin, medieval manuscripts, especially the ones tucked far from the bishop's eye, are full of it. Welcome to the dusty, giggling world of bawdy books and the smut they smuggled between the psalms. You sit beside one of the scribes now. His robes are clean, his tonsure neat, but he has a smirk that makes you suspicious. He's copying a religious tract on purity and abstinence, but in the bottom margin, he's drawn a snail fighting a knight who is completely naked. The next page features a monkey playing bagpipes out of its rear. It's hard to say whether the illustrations are satire or spiritual breakdown, but one thing's for sure, someone was bored, or very human. Here's your historical fact. Many surviving medieval manuscripts, particularly from the 12th to 15th centuries, contain marginalia, those tiny drawings in the edges and corners that have absolutely nothing to do with the text. While some are just decorative or symbolic, others are downright obscene. You'll find nuns plucking phallic-shaped fruit from trees, animals engaging in unprintable activities, and monks flashing each other. It's like the medieval version of doodling genitalia in your notebook margins. Except now those doodles are considered cultural treasures. But the smut wasn't just hidden in the margins. Some texts were straight up erotic. The Romance of the Rose, for example, starts as a dream vision of courtly love and gradually spirals into an allegorical sex ed manual wrapped in poetry. It was one of the most widely read books of the medieval period. And yes, it includes a scene where a man reaches into a woman's rose bush. And, you know what? Let's just say it got symbolic. Very symbolic. Here's your quirky fact. There was a 15th century manuscript known as the Book of Good Love, which combined romantic advice, erotic escapades, and random moralizing. It warned against prostitutes in one chapter, then described a graphic encounter with one in the next. Its author, known as the Archpriest of Hita, basically wrote the medieval version of Do As I Say, not as I just wrote in this incredibly spicy paragraph. You're flipping pages now in a university library. The students here are supposed to be reading Aristotle, but someone's left behind a copy of Speculum Stultorum, the Mirror of Fools, which includes a talking donkey who runs away from celibacy and writes poetry about his own penis. The moral is murky, the audience is giggling, and somehow no one gets excommunicated for this. This brings us to the great scholarly debate. Were these bawdy texts serious? Parodies? Private jokes? Public critiques? Historians are still arguing. Some say the erotic marginalia and suggestive stories were just monks blowing off steam. Others suggest a deeper purpose, using humour and smut to undermine the rigidity of church teachings, to sneak in critiques where they'd be overlooked. After all, if your sermon on lust comes with a drawing of two rabbits getting way too friendly, who's really in charge? You pass now into a noble household, where the lady of the manor keeps a copy of The Art of Courtly Love in her private library. She reads it under the guise of piety, but the text is full of veiled suggestions, metaphors just suggestive enough to light a fire. Her maid, meanwhile, has a dog-eared herbal guide that doubles as contraceptive advice and erotic folklore. These women aren't reading smut. They're reading knowledge, tucked between the leaves like a secret kept alive by candlelight. In another village, a travelling merchant sells medical manuals that explain human reproduction, using diagrams that are suspiciously well rendered for someone who's never touched a woman. The illustrations always feature healthy, muscular men and women with unearthly curves. One page discusses herbal remedies. The next shows a couple in bed, with arrows pointing to things the church would rather not be labelled. People buy it, they read it, and they pass it on. Because where there's ignorance, curiosity blossoms. Now you're seated at a feast, somewhere deep in the countryside. The bard stands to perform. At first it's a standard tale, knights, dragons, ladies. But it quickly devolves into double entendres. The knight's sword is clearly something else. The dragon is symbolic. The lady's tower is, let's not ruin your dinner. Everyone laughs. Even the priest, though he tries to hide it behind a very serious sip of ale. This is the heart of it. For all the preaching and punishment, medieval people still made room for laughter and desire. They read between the lines, they passed notes, copied poems, carved initials into trees, and occasionally added a very enthusiastic phallus to the bottom corner of a sacred text. Because nothing reminds you of your humanity quite like defacing a manuscript with something wildly inappropriate during scribe duty. You finish your visit in a quiet room where a woman sits, copying a passage from the Song of Songs. Her handwriting is neat, reverent, but her eyes betray her amusement. The line she's just written reads, "My beloved put his hand to the latch, and my heart throbbed within me." She pauses, smiles, and under the final word she draws a small, barely noticeable heart. Maybe that's all she can do, but it's something. Because even in ink, in parchment, in Latin and allegory, lust found a way to leave its fingerprints, hidden, marginal, unspoken, but present. And in a world where bodies were punished and desire was feared, those pages may have been the safest place of all to let it live. You close the manuscript and step back into the daylight, blinking against the brightness like someone emerging from a particularly confusing dream, or an ancient erotica binge written in calligraphy. But the streets ahead are no less strange, because now you're not just reading about sex, you're seeing how it plays out on the stage, in the square, at the fairground. Welcome to the performative side of lust, where medieval people laughed at their own sinfulness, made dirty jokes in the town square, and turned sex into public entertainment wrapped in morality. Tonight you're watching lust on stage, and let's just say, it's not subtle. The crowd is already gathering. It's midsummer. The air smells like roasted onions, sweat, and something vaguely livestock adjacent. There's a wooden platform set up at the edge of the marketplace, surrounded by shouting children, bored wives, and a few drunk merchants who've been waiting all year for this. You take your seat, well, a spot on an overturned barrel, and the performance begins. And wow, it takes about 4 seconds before someone's pants fall down. Here's your historical fact. Medieval morality plays and farces were wildly popular, and they didn't shy away from topics like adultery, lust, or sexual foolishness. In fact, they leaned into it. Hard. The morality play was designed to teach Christian virtue through allegorical characters, like lust, gluttony, or good deeds, all battling over the soul of a protagonist. But those plays were often sandwiched between short farces or comic interludes where the sins played out in more human and hilarious ways. If the morality play warned you not to cheat on your spouse, the farce showed what happened when you tried and failed spectacularly. One of the most popular tropes, the horny priest. Yes, clergy were regularly mocked on stage for chasing women, misusing confession, or being seduced by devilish housewives. It was practically its own genre. The audience loved it, part because it was funny, part because it said what everyone was thinking, that even the most pious weren't immune to temptation. And here's your quirky fact. In some French farces, there were elaborate stage gags involving fake genitals. Yes, props, used for comic effect. One play features a character selling enchanted sausages that, once consumed, make women irresistible. Another includes a tailor hiding under a bed while the wife cheats on her husband, only for his needle to poke through the mattress at a very unfortunate moment. Audiences howled, and while no one officially approved of such antics, as long as there was a pious moral tacked on at the end, something vague about sin leading to downfall, everyone pretended it was educational. You glance around the crowd and notice the reactions. The young men guffawing too loud at every joke, the old women smirking behind their shawls, the kids wide-eyed at things they don't quite understand but will definitely ask about later. Even the town priest is lurking near the back, arms folded, pretending to disapprove. But he doesn't leave, because this is how people learn, laugh, and process what no one says out loud in church. This leads us to the scholarly debate. Were these performances purely satire, or did they serve a deeper cultural function? Some argue that farces and erotic morality plays helped people vent their anxieties about sex, sin, and power. Others believe they were tools of control, laugh at lust, mock the sinner, and reinforce the boundaries. And some say they were just entertainment. After all, not every sausage joke has a deeper meaning. You wander now into a noble court, where a different kind of performance is unfolding. Here, lust isn't played for laughs. It's laced into courtly dances, whispered poetry, and veiled glances. Troubadours sing songs about forbidden love, unconsummated passion, the ache of gazing at someone you can't have. Everything's polished, stylized, and full of metaphor. A lady drops her handkerchief. A knight retrieves it and nearly explodes with repressed feeling. Everyone pretends this isn't foreplay in iambic pentameter, but even here the performances serve a purpose. They make lust safe by distancing it. wrapping it in rhyme, disguising it with chivalry. No one says the word sex, but they all think it. Back in the village square, the play's winding down. Lust has been defeated. Sort of. The final scene shows the cheating husband being dragged through the mud by a literal embodiment of guilt, while his wife dances with pride. A friar appears to declare that virtue has won, though he delivers the line while sneaking a look down the actress's bodice. Everyone claps. No one's fooled. You follow a troupe of travelling performers as they pack up their props. Masks, costumes, a suspiciously worn cushion shaped like a backside. They joke about their next stop. One of them, a woman playing Temptation, grins and says, "People always want more of me." She's not wrong. And then there are the stories passed along between towns, the oral plays, the puppet shows, the half-memorised bawdy ballads sung in taverns. Lust made it into every performance medium available. There's even evidence of erotic shadow plays in some port towns, where sailors watch silhouettes of lovers cavorting on cloth screens lit from behind by torchlight. The church hated these, which of course made them even more popular. As the sun dips again, you find yourself humming one of the play's songs. It's catchy, crude, and ends with a wink about a monk who lost his cassock but found delight. You realise this was how medieval people handled the contradiction between their desires and their beliefs, not by denying it, but by turning it into a joke they could all laugh at. Because laughter in the end was its own form of resistance, against shame, against fear, against the idea that lust could only be punished, never understood. And maybe that's why the farce still lingers, why those lewd little plays outlasted the sermons, and why we're still laughing at them today. Even after the laughter fades and the crowds scatter back to their homes, the echoes of desire linger in the cobbled streets and soot-stained walls. You've seen how lust played out in the church, the brothel, the book, and the barn. But there's still one place where it thrived just as fiercely, if a little more quietly: marriage. That supposedly holy institution where lust was allowed, encouraged even, so long as it wore a ring and recited a few psalms. But behind all the church blessings and silk veils, medieval marriage was often more of a deal than a dream. And the lust? Let's just say it didn't always get what it was promised. You find yourself now in a candlelit chamber, where a young bride sits stiffly on the edge of a bed. Her gown is heavy. Her hair has been braided by someone else's hands. She smells of rosewater and nerves. The man beside her, twice her age perhaps, fiddles awkwardly with the sleeve of his doublet. Neither says a word. This is the moment everyone's been waiting for. The consummation. Their families are downstairs toasting, and the marriage isn't considered truly binding until it's been sealed with sex. Your historical fact tonight. In medieval Europe, sex wasn't just allowed in marriage, it was required. Church doctrine taught that consummation was necessary to validate a marriage. Without it, the union could be annulled. There were actual court cases where people had to prove whether they had or had not slept together. Witnesses were called, bedsheets were examined, neighbours testified to what they heard through the walls. Romance indeed. The couple on the bed finally moves, tentatively, mechanically, like two people reenacting a play they've only read once. No one ever taught them how to do this. She was told to submit. He was told to perform. Neither is particularly aroused, but duty doesn't care about desire. They do what they must, then lie still in the quiet. It's done. Everyone can sleep. Here's your quirky fact. In some noble marriages, the consummation was a public affair. Sort of. The couple was escorted to their bedchamber by friends and relatives, cheered on, then left alone for a few minutes before someone came back to peek in and confirm that everything had progressed. Some ceremonies involved actual witnesses standing behind a curtain. Others relied on stained linens brought out for proof. And yes, there were even cases where the king himself received the bloody sheet as political evidence. Privacy was not a strong medieval value. But what about love? Desire? Did lust ever flourish inside marriage, or was it always a polite transaction wrapped in wool and obligation? You wander now through a village where couples have been married for decades. One woman says her husband is a good provider, but she sleeps facing the wall. Another giggles as she describes sneaking away with her spouse when they were younger, hiding behind haystacks for quick kisses and quicker other things. It depends, just like today. For every arranged alliance, there was a couple who actually liked each other. And for every obedient wife, there was a woman who learned how to flirt within the lines. But those lines were strict. The church taught that sex within marriage was acceptable. but only for procreation. Pleasure was a side effect, not a goal. If you enjoyed it too much, even with your lawful spouse, it could still be considered sinful. Lust within marriage was a category of its own. You weren't supposed to want it, you were just supposed to do it. This brings us to a key scholarly debate. Did medieval people really live by the Church's ideal of sex as a reproductive chore, or were those just pious aspirations nobody followed? Some scholars argue that official doctrine had little to do with actual practice, that married couples had sex for many reasons, including love, comfort, and yes, pleasure. Others point to the heavy guilt-tripping in sermons, confessions, and marital handbooks as evidence that people took those teachings seriously, at least enough to feel bad about ignoring them. You step into another home now. A woman nurses a newborn while her husband watches from the corner. He looks tired, but proud. Their hands brush. It's not much, but it's intimate. Real. They've had 4 children. Not all of them survived. Sex for them isn't a performance. It's part of the rhythm of their life. The pleasure is quiet, but present. And then there are the exceptions. The husbands who couldn't perform, the wives who refused, the people who discovered that their desires didn't match the rules. In some places, impotence was legal grounds for annulment. In others, it led to public trials where men had to prove their virility by completing sexual acts in front of witnesses. There are recorded cases of doctors measuring genitals, checking for firmness, even administering stimulating treatments involving hot compresses and very strong wine. Nothing says romance like a panel of judges watching you attempt to fulfill your vows. You leave the village and enter a manor house, where a noblewoman lies in bed, her husband away at war. She reads a love poem by candlelight, something French and dramatic, the kind of verse that speaks of longing, not duty. Her fingers trace the words, her breath slows. She dreams not of her husband, but of something else. Lust lives here too, not in defiance of her vows, but in the quiet space they leave behind. And sometimes, of course, marriage was a prison. Women forced into it too young, men trapped with someone they feared or hated, alliances made for land or power with no room for affection. In those cases, lust didn't vanish. It just leaked out, into affairs, into fantasies, into confessions whispered to the local priest who, inconveniently, might be part of the problem. You sit now in a chapel where a couple kneels side by side. They're renewing vows, something rare but not unheard of. The priest blesses them. They exchange glances that say more than the words. You see it then, for just a flicker. 2 people who've built something and who still want each other. Not because they're told to, not because a bishop said so, but because lust, against all odds, survived the rules. Because marriage in the medieval world wasn't always love, but it could be. And when it was, desire had a place to live that didn't need confession or apology. You step away from the warm hush of the chapel and into the brittle silence of the cloister. Stone columns rise around you, cool and solemn, holding up a sky that seems deliberately unsentimental. This place wasn't built for romance. It was built for renunciation, for turning away. But of course, even here, lust found a crack in the mortar. Because tonight, you're heading straight into the most ironic of battlegrounds, monasteries and convents, where chastity was law and the very idea of desire was supposed to dissolve under layers of prayer, fasting, and itchy wool. You begin in a Benedictine abbey, where the air smells of beeswax and cold bread, and silence is as thick as the stone. A young monk kneels in his cell, fingers curled around his rosary, trying to keep his mind on the Passion of the Christ. But it's not working. His thoughts keep slipping sideways, to the curve of a throat he glimpsed once in the village, to the feel of his own body, to that awful, persistent longing that no number of Ave Marias seems to erase. He weeps, quietly, not just from guilt, but from confusion. How can the flesh ignore such clear commandments? Your historical fact. Despite vows of celibacy, many monastic communities struggled openly with sexual temptation. The Church knew this. Monastic rules include endless warnings about impure thoughts, nocturnal emissions, and the sin of Sodom, which by medieval standards meant a range of acts from masturbation to same-sex intimacy. Confession manuals for monks were often so specific it's hard not to laugh, or cry. One warned of wandering eyes during matins. Another outlined a penance for kissing a fellow brother's neck. The body wasn't just suspect, it was considered the enemy. You move through the corridors now, your sandals whispering across the stone. In another cell, a monk carefully illuminates a manuscript, a scene of St. Anthony being tempted in the desert. But instead of demons with horns and pitchforks, he draws voluptuous women with exposed breasts lounging like pagan goddesses. It's almost too skillful to be accidental. He pauses mid-stroke as if realizing that his hand might be painting his own desires onto the page. Here's your quirky fact. A 12th century monk named Peter the Venerable once wrote that monks should not be shocked by wet dreams, because even the holiest men couldn't control the body entirely. Still, he insisted they confess it promptly, and avoid thinking about women before bed. Some monks tried tying cords around their genitals while sleeping, others slept on cold stone floors. One inventive friar supposedly slept in a coffin to remind the flesh it would soon rot. Sexy. And what about the nuns? You cross the fields now to a nearby convent where the air is quieter still but no less charged. A young sister tends a herb garden, dirt under her nails, her veil slipping slightly as she hums an old love song, one she barely remembers from before the vows. Inside the cloister walls the rules are just as strict, but behind those rules is a private world, one shaped by decades of living in close quarters, sharing beds, confiding secrets, holding hands during prayers, and sometimes something more. Historians now know that emotional and occasionally erotic relationships between nuns were not uncommon. These weren't always romantic in the modern sense, but they often involved longing, touch, and sometimes physical intimacy. Letters between nuns show deep attachment, frustration, even jealousy. In one 13th century account, a nun wrote to her former abbess saying, "I miss the warmth of your embrace more than I miss the Eucharist." Make of that what you will. Here's where the scholarly debate starts to flare. Some researchers argue that we're too eager to see lesbian desire in these records, that the language of medieval affection was simply more intense. Others push back, saying that coded or not, the emotional and physical closeness of convent life inevitably blurred the lines. Either way, lust wasn't just creeping in, it was already here, pacing the halls in bare feet and bad Latin. You slip into a scriptorium where two nuns work quietly. One leans too close to the other, brushes her fingers accidentally, lingers a moment too long. No one speaks. The air crackles with unsaid things. Later they'll both pray longer than usual. One will fast, the other will cry into her pillow, not because they acted necessarily, but because the wanting itself is already the sin. And then there's the practical side. Lust didn't always sneak in with flushed cheeks and longing sighs. Sometimes it was blunt, violent, even organised. In some convents, especially in isolated areas, priests took advantage of their roles as confessors or spiritual directors, using their authority to pressure or assault nuns. These abuses were known, whispered about, even documented, but rarely punished, because chastity might have been sacred, but power was untouchable. You sit now in a dark confessional booth. A nun kneels behind the screen. She whispers her sins, impure dreams, thoughts of a man she once knew, a touch that went too far during laundry duty. The priest listens, sighs, assigns penance, then perhaps reaches through the screen. It's not always a sacred space. Sometimes it's just another room where shame gets exchanged for silence. Not every monastery or convent was a hive of lust. Many lived in genuine devotion, their lives austere, their sacrifices real. But desire didn't care about vows. It didn't vanish when someone shaved their head or took a new name. Lust was still there, tucked under robes, pressed between prayer books, staring back during morning reflection. It wasn't louder here, it was just lonelier. You end the night in a tiny chapel, where a single candle burns near a statue of the Virgin. A monk enters, kneels, stays still. You can't tell if he's praying to be delivered from temptation or for the strength to not act on it. Maybe both. Maybe that's always been the prayer. Because even in a place built to silence the body still speaks. The stars are out again now, crisp and cold above the landscape you've wandered for so long. But tonight, you climb a little higher, not just literally, up a hill toward a lonely stone tower, but metaphorically too. Because the next part of our journey takes place in the realm of myth, metaphor and storytelling, where lust wasn't just acted out in bedrooms or punished in court, it was spun into legend. These weren't just bedtime tales or courtly poems, they were full-blown sexual mythologies, where saints resisted seduction, demons preyed on dreamers, and the body became a battlefield between salvation and desire. You step into a scriptorium where a monk is writing furiously, eyes wide, lips moving as he transcribes a tale that feels half confession, half warning. It's the story of a young anchorite tempted by the devil in the form of a beautiful woman, naked of course, because demons in these tales are nothing if not unsubtle. The woman enters his dreams. She offers him pleasure, kisses like honey, skin like silk, and a whispered promise that no one will ever know. But he resists. Barely. He cuts himself with thorns, sleeps on rocks. Eventually the devil vanishes, defeated by self-denial and a truly horrific rash. Here's your historical fact. Medieval hagiographies, biographies of saints, are filled with stories of sexual temptation, especially involving female saints resisting male predators, or male saints being tormented by demon women. These accounts weren't just moral tales, they were cultural scripts about how virtue is tested and how lust is always just one bad thought away. Mary of Egypt, for instance, spent years as a sex worker before fleeing into the desert to live naked and alone, battling temptation and sunburn in equal measure until her death. The message. Lust might be natural, but only suffering redeems it. You climb the last steps of a ruined tower now, looking out across the valley, and your mind turns to succubi. Those female demons said to visit men in their sleep, draining them of seed and strength. In contrast, incubi attacked women, often during the night, often blamed for unwanted pregnancies. If a monk woke up with stains on his robe, it wasn't a wet dream, it was an assault by a succubus. If a nun gave birth in secret, she might say she'd been visited by a demon. Sometimes they believed it. Sometimes it was the only story that would keep them from the noose. Here's your quirky fact. A 15th century inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer, the same guy behind Malleus Maleficarum, the witch-hunting manual, believed that succubi collected semen during nocturnal visits and passed it to incubi, who then used it to impregnate women. Demonic sperm laundering, if you will. He wrote this with a straight face, in Latin, and probably thought he was doing science. Back in town you hear a bard reciting Tristan and Isolde, the doomed lovers caught in a tangled web of lust, magic potions and royal betrayal. You've heard this one before. The two drink a love potion by mistake, fall madly for each other, and spend the rest of their lives trying and failing to stay apart. It's not just a story of passion. It's about how lust undoes order, threatens kings, and turns loyalty into longing. The Middle Ages loved that contradiction. Lust was dangerous, yes, but it was also thrilling, tragic, noble even. You pass a group of pilgrims now sitting by a fire trading stories about saints and miracles. One man insists he heard of a woman who wore a belt of iron around her waist for 30 years to resist lust. Another says his cousin saw a man possessed by a sex demon screaming the names of every girl he'd ever wanted before he bit off his own tongue. The line between theology and horror movie is blurry at best, and here's where the scholarly debate spirals. Were these stories genuinely believed, or just allegories? Were succubi real threats, or excuses for nocturnal emissions and scandalous pregnancies? Some historians argue that these mythologies provided a kind of psychological safety net. If you sinned, it wasn't you. It was a demon, a spell, a curse. Others believe these stories reveal how deeply embedded lust was in the medieval consciousness, so powerful it had to be fought with monsters. You slip into a small chapel now where stained glass glows red and blue against the stone. One panel shows St. Margaret bursting from the belly of a dragon, naked and triumphant. Another shows St. Agnes, hair flowing, as she turns away from a soldier trying to strip her. Her chastity is so potent, the artist shows the man collapsing in agony just from trying. These aren't just stories, they're spectacles. Testaments to the idea that controlling your desire doesn't just make you holy, it makes you powerful. But not every tale ends with restraint. You hear murmurs about the tale of the knight and the loathly lady, where a man marries a hideous woman only to discover she becomes beautiful if he lets her choose her own fate. The moral. True desire only becomes noble when it respects agency. That might sound modern, but the tale is centuries old. The Middle Ages weren't all chastity and torture. Sometimes they understood consent better than we give them credit for. Night thickens. You sit beside a group of novice monks telling ghost stories, and one pipes up with a tale of a nobleman who visited a witch to make his wife lust for him again. The spell worked, but so well she never let him sleep, and eventually he went mad and threw himself into the river. Everyone laughs. It's a joke. But also, not. You lie back now on the cold grass, stars pulsing overhead. You think of all those stories, whispers of seduction, warnings carved in glass, saints sweating through temptation, and demons that creep in through dreams. For medieval people, lust was never just a feeling. It was a mythic force, part danger, part ecstasy, always a test. And the tales they told didn't just entertain, they helped them name the unnameable, explain the forbidden, justify the fear, and occasionally dream of something more. Because even in a world that feared lust, they couldn't stop telling stories about it. It's the final stretch now. The firelight of the past is burning low, but the heat of it still flickers on your skin. You've wandered through churches, brothels, bedrooms, gardens, dungeons, and dreams, chasing the shadow of desire through a world both obsessed with it and terrified by it. But before we wrap this up and tuck it in, there's one last place to stop. One final landscape where lust played out in its most volatile, dangerous form. Tonight, you walk into the storm of sexual scandal and social collapse, where one misstep could ruin you, where the power of desire collided with power itself, and where the price of lust wasn't guilt or gossip, but blood. You're at a castle now, stone rising into the night like the bones of ambition. Inside, torches crackle and music spills down the hallways like wine. It's not a feast exactly, it's more a power display. Nobles in velvet eye each other across silver plates, servants move like shadows, and at the head of the table a lord drinks too much and stares too long at a woman who is not his wife. She notices, she smiles, and the air shifts. Everyone sees it. No one dares speak. Here's your historical fact. Sexual scandal in medieval courts was more than just embarrassing. It could be catastrophic. For queens, princesses, or noble women, an accusation of adultery, even whispered, could lead to disgrace, imprisonment, or death. One of the most infamous cases? Queen Marguerite of Burgundy, accused of adultery with a knight in the early 14th century. The fallout included arrests, executions, and lasting damage to the French monarchy. It wasn't just her body on trial, it was the political stability of the entire kingdom. And let's be clear, the power imbalance was always tilted. A man might be forgiven for a mistress, even praised for virility. But a woman's desire, real or imagined, was a ticking bomb. Lust wasn't just personal, it was political. Who she slept with could decide the legitimacy of heirs, the fate of treaties, the future of dynasties. In the flickering torchlight you see a servant girl being cornered by a visiting knight. His voice is low, coaxing. She laughs nervously. Behind them, another servant watches with dead eyes. This isn't new. This happens every time there's a feast, every time power gets drunk on its own reflection. And if the girl gets pregnant, she'll be blamed. He'll be gone. Or worse, he'll pay someone to silence the consequence. Which brings us to your quirky fact. In some medieval courts, noblewomen were accused of using potions or magical charms to seduce men, especially if the affair disrupted political plans. One tale from the 15th century Italy accused a duchess of slipping a love spell into her husband's drink to keep him from straying. Another involved a lady-in-waiting who supposedly wore a necklace made from hair and blessed wax to drive a prince mad with lust. Whether true or invented, the implication was the same. If a woman wielded sexual power, it had to be witchcraft. And now we arrive at the scholarly debate. Were medieval scandals really about sex? Or were they always about power? Who had it? Who lost it? And who used the accusation of lust as a weapon? Most historians lean toward the latter. Lust was rarely punished for its own sake. It was punished when it broke something bigger. Laws, marriages, hierarchies, alliances. A servant caught with another servant might get whipped. A servant caught with a noble? That was treason. You find yourself in a small court hearing now. The accused is a young woman, pretty, shaken, dirt on her hem. She's charged with immodesty, a phrase that could mean anything from flirting to being found in the wrong place at the wrong time. The man, not present. The judges, all men, deliberate while she weeps silently. The verdict is swift. she'll be punished. He'll be remembered fondly, if at all. And sometimes scandal wasn't just about individuals. Entire communities collapsed under sexual panic. In one German town in the 15th century, several women were accused of seducing priests and nobles, then using their influence to commit witchcraft. The trials ended in multiple executions. The town, shaken and fractured, never fully recovered. The real crime? Probably envy, or fear, or someone wanting their land. But not every scandal ended in tragedy. Some lovers ran, escaped, disappeared into the woods or across borders, living new lives under false names. Ballads were written about them. Most were fictional, a few were true. In these stories, lust wasn't shameful. It was the spark that burned through injustice. You want to believe in them. You hope someone made it. You wander now into a ruined keep, grass growing between the stones. Centuries ago, it belonged to a baron who was accused of keeping his sister-in-law as a concubine. No one proved it. But after the accusation, the peasants revolted, the keep was stormed, and the family vanished. Now only crows live here. And the story, the scandal never dies, it just gets retold. Finally, you arrive at a city square, empty under the moon, where once a woman was paraded half-naked through the streets for adultery. People jeered, threw things, said she deserved it. The man was never named. But she lives forever in the records. A lesson, a warning, a name scrawled in red ink beside the word carnal. And that's the truth medieval people knew all too well. Lust could raise you up or destroy you. If you were rich, male, and powerful, it was an indulgence. If you weren't, it was a weapon waiting to be turned against you. And even now, standing in the silence, you can feel that tension humming beneath the stone. Because in a world ruled by fear, the worst thing you could do was want something you weren't allowed to touch. You stand at the edge of the past now, toes just brushing the threshold of the present. Behind you, 30 paths winding through fields of fire and silk, sin and silence, shame and satire. You've seen how lust in the medieval world was a force to be feared, mocked, punished, hidden, and yet always pursued. It was tucked inside confessional booths, scratched into margins, flaunted in taverns, and locked inside noble towers. It stirred beneath habits, beneath armour, beneath everything. And maybe that's the thing to carry with you into sleep. That for all the rituals and relics and hellfire warnings, medieval people were still human. They laughed at sex, they wept over it, they feared it, they chased it. Sometimes they hurt each other with it. Sometimes they healed. Their world was ruled by religion, but their nights were ruled by longing. The same ache, the same blush, the same breathless pause before a touch that changed everything. The difference? They had fewer choices, no privacy, no language for the things that bloomed inside them. So they built a world of metaphors, saints, punishments, and whispered stories to make sense of it all. And now, centuries later, we still peer into their lives with fascination, not just because they were repressed or extreme, but because in all that noise we see a reflection of ourselves, our questions, our contradictions, our quiet obsessions. So, as you slip under the covers tonight, let your thoughts drift, not to the sin or the punishment, but to the soft defiance of wanting something in a world that tells you not to. Because lust, in the end, is just another way we remember we're alive.